Before the lights in the sky, before time slipped away, before anyone had ever heard their names, there were just two people, Betty and Barney Hill. Ordinary lives. They weren't seeking mystery. They weren't chasing the unknown. They were practical, grounded, human. And yet, the extraordinary found them. Betty Hill, born Eunice Elizabeth Barrett, spent her days helping families, walking quietly through her community, listening, caring, trying to make life a little kinder. Fantasy had little place in her steady world. Barney Hill carried a different weight. A World War II veteran, a postal worker, a civil rights advocate, he lived by responsibility and order. He believed in seeing the world clearly, in speaking up when others stayed silent. Yet even the clearest eyes can be open to the impossible. On the night of September 19th, 1961, as they drove home through the shadowed White Mountains, a single point of light appeared in the sky. At first, it seemed ordinary, but it moved differently. And that was when the ordinary slipped quietly into the extraordinary. This is a story of that night, the lights, the lost time, the dreams that followed, and of two people who found themselves at the edge of something beyond understanding. Chapter 1. The People and the Encounter. Before the lights in the sky, before the hours that seemed to vanish, before the world ever knew their names, there were simply two people, Betty and Barney Hill. Ordinary, grounded people whose lives were built on the careful rhythms of everyday responsibility, on the soft, human pulse of caring for others and seeking justice in a world that did not always give it. They were not looking for the extraordinary, and yet the extraordinaries found them. Betty Hill, born Eunice Elizabeth Barrett, grew up among the rolling hills and quiet towns of New Hampshire, where neighbors greeted each other at the corner store, and the pace of life allowed for reflection and care. She was a daughter, a friend, and later, a woman who dedicated herself to the welfare of others. As a social worker, she spent her days weaving herself into the lives of struggling families, seeing the small details of their hardships, and offering help where it could make the most difference. Her life was practical, structured, and purposeful. She did not dream wildly of stars or flying objects. Her concerns were immediate, human, tangible: the welfare of children, the fairness of opportunity, the small kindnesses that shaped ordinary lives. Barney Hill carried a different weight. Born in Newport News, Virginia, he had been shaped by the discipline of the military and the chaos of a world at war. He served in the U.S. Army during World War II, and the structure of routine, responsibility, and precision became part of his character. After the war, he returned to civilian life with the same steady determination, working long hours for the Postal Service and engaging in his community. He believed in justice, not in theory, but in practice. He stood with the NAACP during a time when silence was easier than action, speaking up when many remained quiet, asserting the dignity of those who had little voice. Together, Betty and Barney formed a bond both strong and tender. In the early 1960s, their interracial marriage was a quiet act of courage, a daily negotiation with the world's judgments, whispers, and occasional hostility. Their love was built on endurance, shared values, and the subtle but persistent effort to create a life that felt peaceful and authentic, despite the currents of prejudice around them. They attended a Unitarian church, engaged in community groups, and nurtured each other's dreams while keeping their feet firmly planted on the earth. And then, on a quiet September evening in 1961, something extraordinary had touched their lives, something that would lift them beyond the ordinary and place them at the center of one of the most studied, most mysterious, and most debated encounters in modern history. They did not seek it. They could not have imagined it. And that is precisely what made it so compelling. The world noticed them because these were people who were real, relatable, and grounded. When ordinary lives intersect with the inexplicable, the contrast is sharp. It feels weighty, tangible, impossible to dismiss. It began as a vacation, a few days away, a spontaneous decision to breathe in the mist of Niagara Falls, to wander through the streets of Montreal, to let themselves step outside the pressures and rhythms of daily life. The air smelled of water and stone. The evenings were soft with fading sunlight, and for a few moments, the world felt suspended, calm, and ordinary. There was laughter, The quiet companionship of two people who had spent years navigating life side by side, and the ease of a routine that allowed them to exist simply together. But on their drive home, on September 19th, 1961, the ordinary gave way to something entirely different. The road through the White Mountains of New Hampshire stretched before them, dark and narrow, flanked by the shadows of pines and the silent presence of stone cliffs. It was a night that would begin unremarkably soft, still, predictable, and then fracture. Betty's eyes caught a light, small at first, distant, hovering in the blackness beyond the treetops. She thought it might be a satellite. Something harmless, ordinary. But satellites do not surge brighter. They do not curve as though following a path with intent. They do not appear to watch. Her pulse quickened, not wildly, not yet, but enough that she sensed something different. Barney, ever rational, tried to anchor the moment. "It's just an aeroplane," he said, his voice steady, a tether to normality. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it could be explained. But the light moved, and it moved in ways that refused explanation. It descended, it darted, it hovered, and a tension, cold and undeniable, seeped into their awareness. They stopped the car, then again, then once more. Each time, the light responded, as though acknowledging them, observing them. Betty retrieved her binoculars, her fingers trembling, not from fear alone, but from a sense that what she was seeing defied ordinary understanding. The craft took shape in her vision, a saucer-like object, rounded, flattened, with multicolored lights spinning softly around its edges. The air around it shimmered in a way that felt alive, as though the atmosphere itself was bending toward it. Barney took the binoculars from her, stepping out into the forest that seemed to quiet, to still, his boots pressed into the dirt, his breath coming in shallow, tense rhythms. And then the craft drew close. Just 80 to 100 feet above them, it hovered, and the shapes within became figures, humanoid, moving deliberately, visible in the craft's windows. Their eyes met his one figure's gaze, anchoring him with a strange, undeniable presence. And then, a command, not spoken aloud, but lodged inside his mind. "Stay where you are." Fear struck. Like ice, his muscles tensed, his hands gripping the binoculars until knuckles whitened. The world narrowed to the width of the road, the whisper of the trees, the faint hum of a machine that seemed to exist beyond sound. He stumbled back toward the car, shouting, and in that moment, a soft rhythmic beeping filled the air, mechanical and deliberate. The sensation washed over them, a distortion that unraveled awareness and memory alike. When consciousness returned, they were 35 miles away, near Ashland. Hours had passed, though it felt like moments. Their minds struggled to map the missing time, to place the pieces of an experience that existed just beyond the edges of comprehension. At home, anomalies, watches that had stopped, never to move again. Scuff marks on Barney's shoes, as if he had been dragged across unseen surfaces. Betty's dress torn and dusted with a strange pink powder, organic but enigmatic. Circular patterns on the car's trunk caused compasses to spin in unnatural ways. And then, the dreams began. On September 30th, Betty's sleep carried her into vivid, repeating visions. Gray-skinned beings, strange instruments, cold metallic interiors. She experienced procedures that felt both clinical and intimate, as though memory itself was guiding the narrative of the night they could not recall. These were not dreams. They were memories reaching for recognition, bridging consciousness and experience in ways that defied explanation. By 1963, the weight of the unknown led them to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist of careful reputation. Under hypnosis, separately, their narratives unfolded in chilling parallel. Barney described beings 5 feet tall, with pear-shaped heads, and large, dark, unblinking eyes. "Those eyes," he whispered during a session, voice taut. I felt them push into mine. The terror was immediate, raw, and impossible to fabricate. Betty described a leader, a language murmured softly, and interactions that seemed both clinical and oddly deliberate. She recalled tests and procedures, and the presentation of a star map that she later reproduced from memory. Marjorie Fish, an amateur astronomer, would eventually attempt to match her drawings with real star systems, suggesting Zeta Reticuli as the origin. The theory sparked fascination, even as skeptics such as Carl Sagan cautioned the pattern might be coincidence. Believers point to physical evidence, hypnotic consistency, radar corroboration, and official records. Skeptics point to stress, hallucination, memory suggestion, and cultural influences. The truth remains elusive, residing in the intersection of physical traces, human psychology, and lived experience. The Hills' encounter was not simple. It was not ordinary. It left indelible marks on their bodies, on their minds, and on history itself. For over 6 decades, the questions endure, whispered along highways, debated in archives, reflected in the endless human fascination with what lies beyond the familiar. And so their story begins to ordinary people, walking a familiar road, touched by the extraordinary in a way that would forever ripple across time. A story of wonder, fear, and mystery, told not in headlines or statistics, but in the quiet, vivid moments of 2 lives that will never be the same again. The night was long, the road still, and the world quietly waiting for what would come next. Chapter 2. The Night That Time Stood Still. Time has a curious rhythm when the ordinary bends into the extraordinary. Minutes stretch, hours vanish, and the mind struggles to hold on to the shape of reality. For Betty and Barney Hill, the night of September 19th, 1961, became a tapestry of moments that would never fully unravel, a sequence that stitched itself into their lives forever. And though the world might only remember a bright light in the sky, those hours were far more than a single sighting. They were a journey through something beyond explanation. The Hills had begun their vacation like any other couple, seeking brief respite from life's demands. Niagara Falls, Montreal, laughter in small cafes, the quiet thrill of seeing streets they hadn't walked before. It was a pause, a gentle retreat into the ease of travel. And yet, every story has a moment where the rhythm shifts, where the safe becomes uncertain. And that shift arrived slowly as they drove south in US Route 3 through the White Mountains. The mountains themselves seemed to lean closer that night. Shadows pressed against the edges of the road. The wind whispered through the pines, not sharply, but as if carrying a subtle warning. Barney drove steadily, his hands firm on the wheel, while Betty's eyes flicked to the dark horizon, expecting nothing, noticing everything. And then it appeared, a tiny point of light hovering above the distant trees. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Perhaps a satellite, perhaps a distant plane. But as they continued, the light shifted in ways that defied expectation. It brightened, then dimmed. It moved sideways, paused, and darted again. Barney tried to rationalize it. Just an airplane, he said, more to steady his own growing unease than to convince her. But his voice carried a tension he could not hide, and Betty felt it in the tightening of her chest. The Hills pulled over, first once, then twice, compelled by a mix of curiosity and caution. Each time they stopped, the light responded not like an accident of nature, but like something aware of them, observing, considering. Betty brought out her binoculars, hands trembling slightly as she focused. The object, now unmistakably structured, seemed pancake-shaped, edges illuminated with strange, multicolored lights that swirled in patterns, almost hypnotic. Barney stepped closer, binoculars raised, and in that still forest silence, he felt the air itself grow dense, as if holding its breath. And then the craft drew near, closer than anything they had imagined. Hovering just 80 to 100 feet above the road, it revealed figures within. 8, maybe 11. Humanoid shapes, standing, observing. Their features were indistinct at first, yet there was presence, awareness, intelligence. One figure seemed to lock onto Barney, and a shiver passed through him as he felt not heard. A command in his mind. Stay where you are. A wave of fear overtook him. His hands clenched the binoculars. His legs trembled. The forest, once familiar, now seemed alien. He turned, stumbled back toward the car, words caught in his throat. They're going to capture us. And that was when the sound began. Soft, rhythmic, mechanical beeping that rolled through the air and seeped into his mind. Time changed. The world shifted. Awareness slipped away like grains of sand through fingertips. And when it returned, they were 35 miles south, near Ashland, disoriented, unsure of how the hours had passed. Their watches were stopped, their sense of continuity broken. Something had occurred, but what exactly remained elusive, hidden in the folds of memory and shadow. The aftermath settled over them gradually, layer by layer. Barney noticed scuffs on his shoes, marks that suggested more than a simple walk. Betty discovered her dress torn and dusted with a pinkish powder, according to later analysis, but inconclusive in meaning. The car itself held mysteries. Small circular marks on the trunk, spots that made compasses spin violently when approached, and nights brought dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. On September 30th, Betty's dreams took her back to a roadblock, two gray-skinned beings leading them through cold, metallic corridors to instruments and procedures that puzzled the mind as much as the body. By late 1963, the weight of these unexplained hours and recurring dreams became unbearable. The Hills sought the guidance of Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist known for his work with memory and trauma. Through hypnosis, separately conducted so each could not influence the other, the hidden hours began to reveal themselves in fragmented clarity. Barney described beings about 5 feet tall, with pear-shaped heads and immense, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce not just vision, but thought itself. His words, spoken under the calm influence of the sessions, trembled with the rawness of immediate fear. "Oh, those eyes," he whispered during one session. I felt like the eyes had pushed into my eyes. Betty's recollections were equally vivid. She described a leader among the beings, speaking in a murmured, alien tongue, attempting broken English. She remembered clinical procedure skin samples, small needles, careful examinations that blended medical detachment with something altogether otherworldly. And then there was the star map, an intricate depiction she later drew from memory, illustrating a journey across the cosmos, one that amateur astronomer Marjorie Fish would attempt to match 2 real star systems, including Zeta Reticuli. The findings captivated the public imagination, even as skeptics like Carl Sagan argued randomness could explain the patterns. The investigations that followed only deepened the intrigue. NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, documented the Hills' account with seriousness, noting the precision and consistency in their testimony. Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's official UFO study, labeled the case inconclusive, neither confirming nor dismissing the events. Later reviews by MUFON and declassified FBI files offered subtle corroborations radar readings, interviews, and the absence of any signs of hoax, while psychological analyses explored memory, trauma, and suggestion. Even today, debates continue, circling the middle ground between belief and skepticism, fact and perception. The timeline of the Hills' story stretches far beyond the night itself. On October 25, 1965, the Boston Traveler printed the story, turning private experience into public phenomenon. In 1966, The Interrupted Journey gave their words lasting permanence. Barney's death in 1969, Betty's in 2004, the 1975 television adaptation, the 2011 historical marker at Indian Head, and even the 2025 film production. Each moment adds layers to a story that refuses to fade, echoing across decades. And underlying it all is a question that refuses to be answered definitively. What really happened on that dark road in Tetkit, observing night? Geography, too, played a silent role. The White Mountains, breathtaking by daylight, became a corridor of solitude and uncertainty at night. The narrow pass of Franconia Notch, the descent at Indian Head, the awakening near Ashlandish location added texture to the encounter. Each mile a canvas for memory, fear, and wonder. Even now, travelers report the subtle hum of unease when tracing the same route, the mountains themselves holding on to secrets they cannot voice. The Hill case demonstrates the delicate dance between memory, perception, and experience. Initial sighting, close approach, missing time. Medical procedures. Each element adds to a mosaic that is neither easily dismissed nor fully understood. Believers cite physical evidence, radar data, and hypnotic consistency. Skeptics point to stress, suggestion, and possible hallucinations. The truth, as often happens in human experience, seems to live between the two, in the space where reality, fear, and imagination intertwine. And so, the night of September 19th does not rest quietly in history. It lingers, a quiet pulse in the collective memory of UFO research. A story that teaches us about perception, human vulnerability, and the subtle ways the unknown can touch even the most grounded lives. It reminds us that extraordinary events do not always come with explanations, that some nights change the world in ways we cannot measure, and that two ordinary people can hold a story extraordinary enough to echo through time. Even decades later, the Hill's experience continues to inspire, puzzle, and haunt. Their timeline is more than dates on paper. It is a journey through fear, curiosity, and awe. And the more we try to understand it, the more it asks of us. How much of the universe is waiting quietly beyond the reach of our senses, and how often does it choose to reveal itself in fleeting, unexplainable moments? Sometimes, the most ordinary drive home carries the most extraordinary secrets. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Unknown. Even after the lights disappeared, even after the hours slipped through their memory like water through fingers, the world of Betty and Barney Hill had changed forever. The night of September 19th did not simply fade into the past. It lingered soft, insistent, impossible to ignore. Every glance at the stars, every moment alone on a quiet street, every subtle hum of the world around them became a reminder that something extraordinary had brushed against their ordinary lives. And in that lingering presence, the Hill story transformed from personal experience into a mirror for society, for belief, for wonder, and for the questions we rarely dare to ask. It is often said that the Hills' encounter was the first widely documented alien abduction. But to understand why it matters, why people are still talking about it more than 60 years later, we need to look beyond the lights, beyond the craft, beyond the missing time. We need to see what ripples their stories sent across culture, consciousness, and even the very way we measure credibility. In the years that followed, the Hills became unwilling guides for a conversation that stretched far wider than New Hampshire. Governments, researchers, journalists, and ordinary people all found themselves tracing the faint outline of that September night, trying to decipher what happened and why. UAP hearings, debates about witness credibility, discussions of trauma, memory, and perception, all of these have threads that lead back to the quiet couple who once simply wanted a vacation. Betty and Barney's story offered a template, a structure. The lights in the sky, the encounter, the missing time, the examinations, the memories surfacing under hypnosis. After that, nearly every abduction story carried the echoes of their experience. Yet it was not only the content of the encounter that made it powerful, it was the context of their lives, their identities, and their humanity. They were not fringe believers or attention seekers. They were grounded, thoughtful, active citizens. Barney, a veteran and postal worker, had lived a life of discipline, responsibility, and advocacy. Betty, a social worker, had spent her days tending to children and families in need, quietly shaping the lives of those around her. And together, as an interracial couple in early 1960s America, they faced subtle prejudice and overt judgment, yet continued to hold themselves with dignity. Their story did not exist in a vacuum. It intersected with civil rights, with questions of who is believed and who is ignored. It intersected with the dawn of New Age consciousness, when people began to look inward, to explore dreams, inner visions, and the unseen. Their story was human first and extraordinary second. The cultural footprint of the Hill case is vast. Long before the Greys became iconic, long before UFO abduction entered the lexicon of popular culture, the Hills' account shaped how people imagined contact with the unknown. Small, gray-skinned beings with large, dark eyes, conducting strange but clinical examinations, became a template repeated in books, films, and television. The X-Files, American Horror Story, documentaries, and even the 2025 film revisiting their case all carry echoes of their experience. Their story established the rhythm of an alien encounter, initial sighting, fear, observation, examination, and memory resurfacing. And because they were ordinary, credible people, audiences and researchers alike were drawn into the possibility that this could happen to anyone. Even today, when someone watches congressional UAP testimony, When an investigative journalist reports a strange sighting, or when an astronomer discusses anomalies in the sky, the subconscious influence of the Hill story is present. It shaped not only the narrative, but the way we interpret observation, the way we gauge credibility, and the way we navigate the line between skepticism and belief. Their experience teaches us that the unexplained does not always arrive with clarity or certainty. Sometimes it arrives softly, lingering at the edge of perception, refusing to be fully defined. Relating to the Hill story is easier than one might think. You do not need to have seen a UFO or lost hours of your life. Anyone who has experienced a vivid dream that clung too tightly to waking memory. Anyone who has felt a fleeting, unexplained sense of presence. Anyone who has glimpsed something beyond their understanding. These experiences touch the same quiet chord. The Hill's narrative resonates because it is deeply human. It is fear, curiosity, vulnerability, and all wrapped together, illuminated against the dark backdrop of the unknown. For those who wish to explore further, there are gentle steps that do not demand belief, but encourage reflection. Read the archives, both believer and skeptic accounts. Compare perspectives, noticing where memory, perception, and interpretation intersect. Study the psychology of memory, trauma, and sleep, where the edges of consciousness often blur. Watch UAP hearings, noting the subtleties of witness testimony. Reflect on your own experiences, questioning what might lie beneath ordinary awareness. The Hill case encourages balance, a measured curiosity that neither clings too tightly to skepticism nor surrenders blindly to belief. The hypnotic sessions conducted by Dr. Benjamin Simon remain central to understanding the encounter. Individually, the Hills recall the events of the missing hours with uncanny consistency. Barney spoke of pear-shaped headed beings, immense black eyes, and the overwhelming presence that pressed not physically but mentally. Betty described a leader among the beings, soft murmuring languages, tests, examinations, and the star map. These memories, emerging under careful guidance, provided a bridge between conscious experience and subconscious recollection. They offered a glimpse into an event so extraordinary that ordinary language often fails to convey it fully. Over decades, the case inspired countless investigations. NICUP documented early testimonies. Project Blue Book cataloged and assessed the encounter. Later studies by MAUFON and independent researchers continued the dialogue. Skeptics proposed psychological explanations, suggestion, sleep disturbances, but even these studies acknowledged details that resisted conventional interpretation. The tension between explanation and mystery is precisely what gives the Hill case its enduring allure. It is a story that never resolves completely because it asks something more from its observers. It asks them to sit with ambiguity, to notice the limits of understanding, and to honor the humanity at the center of the experience. The timeline of the Hill story extends far beyond the encounter itself. The Boston Traveler article in 1965 first brought their experience to a wider audience. The Interrupted Journey, published in 1966, preserved their voices for millions of readers. Television dramatizations, historical markers at Indian Head, and renewed cinematic interpretations all echo the original narrative. Yet the core remains the same. Two people, ordinary in every measurable way, touched by the extraordinary, leaving behind a story that refuses to end. And perhaps that is why the case matters. Not because it provides answers, but because it provokes questions. Questions about perception, about memory, about trust, about the thin threads that separate ordinary life from the inexplicable. Questions about courage, about the willingness to step into uncertainty and describe what cannot be neatly explained. In the calm of the night, when the world is quiet, the Hill's story reminds us that even in the most ordinary moments, the extraordinary may be quietly waiting, unseen, softly pressing against the edge of awareness. Even now, over 60 years later, the echoes of that night ripple outward. Modern UFO research, pop culture, government inquiries, and personal curiosity all carry traces of that September evening. And yet, the Hill's experience is not only about the unknown, it is about connection, about how humanity responds to what it cannot fully understand. Their story is an invitation to watch, to wonder, to question, and to sit in the space where disbelief and possibility meet. The night stretches endlessly in memory, yet it is not frightening. It is calm, curious, and strange, like a distant star that draws the eye and holds it, not with force, but with quiet insistence. The Hills encounter is a reminder that extraordinary moments are often subtle, intimate, and deeply human. That sometimes the most profound mysteries arrive not with thunder or alarm, but with a soft, insistent whisper. Look closer, pay attention, remember. And so the story of September 19th lives not just as history, but as reflection. It encourages us to hold space for the unexplained, to recognize that life is layered with meaning, and that ordinary people can witness events that challenge understanding. The Hills remind us that the unknown is not always terrifying. It is often gentle, strange, and full of possibility. It is not an ending, but a beginning, an invitation to notice the subtle magic woven into the world around us. Even in the silence that follows, even in the calm after the extraordinary, the questions remain. What is out there, waiting? How much of reality slips just beyond perception? And how do ordinary lives intersect with events so extraordinary they cannot be forgotten? The Hills lived the questions, not the answers, and in that, they left a legacy far richer than the lights or the craft. They left a story that teaches us to observe, to wonder, and to embrace the mysteries that surround us. Sometimes, the most ordinary road carries a story that stretches across decades, touching every eye that looks to the stars. Chapter 4, Whispers in the Sky. The night sky has always held a quiet authority, an unspoken invitation to wonder. For most people, it is a backdrop to sleep, a canvas of distant stars twinkling harmlessly, comforting in its constancy. But for Betty and Barney Hill, that canvas had become something far more intimate, far more insistent. The night of September 19th, 1961, left its mark not only on the clock, the car, or the fabric of memory. It had touched their perception of the sky itself. Each light, each flicker, each shifting point in the darkness became a whisper of something beyond ordinary understanding. As weeks passed after the encounter, ordinary nights began to feel different. Driving home, walking through familiar streets, or gazing at the treetops, swaying under the wind, the Hills often caught themselves pausing, listening, not for sounds, exactly not for voices, but for subtle shifts in their environment. A glimmer of movement, a change in the way shadows stretched, a sense that the world had grown larger, yet quieter. Every day once familiar, now held hints of the extraordinary. It was in these quiet moments that curiosity and unease merged. The mind searches for patterns, for explanations, and yet the Hills had little to anchor themselves. Friends offered reassurances. Perhaps it was a trick of light, a passing plane, fatigue, or stress. But these words never quite settled the tension. Something had happened that could not be neatly catalogued or dismissed. Something had left impressions too tangible, too persistent, to ignore. The images from that night came back slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, layered by layer. Barney could recall the precise shape of the craft, hovering silently above the road, its edges pulsing with colors that seemed alive. Betty remembered the figures, their forms enigmatic, their presence simultaneously clinical and watchful. And beneath it all, the memory of the missing hours remained a gap that no ordinary explanation could fill. One evening, as the couple sat together in the gentle warmth of their living room, Barney traced his finger along the edge of a paper on the Tabbola sketch of the star map Betty had drawn from memory under hypnosis. He leaned back, eyes narrowing as he considered the constellations, trying to imagine how any ordinary mind could produce such a diagram so precisely. Do you ever wonder if someone, somewhere, is looking back at us the same way we looked at them? He asked, softly. Betty, holding a cup of tea, nodded, feeling a quiet shiver in her chest. The thought lingered, unspoken yet palpable. The universe may hold eyes watching quietly, patiently, beyond comprehension. The fascination with the night sky took on new dimensions. Betty began to catalog her dreams, writing down every fragment, every fleeting sense of sound, texture, or motion. Some dreams were fragmented windows opening to unknown rooms, metallic corridors, cold instruments, but others contained startling clarity. Maps, symbols, soft murmurs, and patterns that seemed deliberate. She noticed subtle repetitions, Small details she could not explain, and yet they were inscribed with a vividness that made her pulse quicken. Barney, too, found himself staring at the sky more often, binoculars resting nearby, even on evenings when no light was expected. He measured movement against familiar constellations, traced the flight paths of stars and satellites, but the observations always brought more questions than answers. Each object that moved unnaturally, each shift that contradicted gravity or expectation, became a thread tugging at the edges of certainty. He could no longer see the sky as a static backdrop. It had become a stage for something alive, aware, inscrutable. And yet, the hills carried on with life. Ordinary days required ordinary tasks. Mail routes, social work meetings, grocery trips, church gatherings. But the extraordinary had seeped in, coloring even mundane moments. Betty would pause mid-conversation, her mind recalling the strange instruments or the leader of the beings she had seen. Barney's hand would linger on the binoculars as he checked the horizon. Their shared glance often spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement that the world had expanded in ways no one else could see. In 1963, under Dr. Benjamin Simon's guidance, the hills began to unlock more of the missing hours through hypnosis. These sessions were delicate and meticulous, requiring patience, focus, and a profound trust in the mind's ability to reveal hidden truths. Each session felt like wading into a quiet river of memory, unsure where the current might carry them. Barney would describe the sensations of being aboard the craft, the hum of energy, the metallic coolness beneath his hands, the eyes of the beings penetrating with an intensity he could scarcely describe. Betty, in parallel sessions, reconstructed the experience with her own layers of detail, the language-like murmurs, the precision of tests, the star map unfolding in her mind's eye. These revelations were unsettling, not only for the content, but for the certainty with which they emerged. Two people, recounting the same events separately, described them with eerie consistency. For outsiders, it was compelling, mysterious, and sometimes unsettling. For the hills, it was a quiet persistence, a reminder that the encounter had not been fleeting or accidental. It had left a permanent imprint on their consciousness. As word of the Hill case spread, their story became a reference point for a growing community of UFO researchers, enthusiasts, and skeptics. NECAP and Project Blue Book cataloged the event. Journalists reported it. And later, psychologists examined it for clues about human perception and memory. Yet despite the scrutiny, the night retained its secrets. Observers could discuss it endlessly, analyze it rigorously, and even dramatize it for film and television. But the core was quiet. Hovering moments on U.S. Route 3 remained intimate, personal, and stubbornly resistant to explanation. The night sky itself seemed to carry an echo of that evening. Stars twinkled with familiar constancy, but in moments of reflection, the hills felt the subtle pulse of something larger, something watching, something beyond human understanding. It was not fear that gripped them, but a serene alertness, a quiet curiosity intertwined with caution. They became chroniclers of the unknown, observers of a vast, layered reality that moved at the edge of perception. And in that quiet vigilance, there was a subtle transformation. The hills encounter was no longer just a single event. It had become a lens through which they viewed all subsequent experiences. Shadows carried nuance, light carried intent, and silence carried meaning. Ordinary life existed alongside extraordinary possibility, each influencing the other in ways they could not fully articulate. It was a life lived with a heightened sense of awareness, where wonder and caution danced together like the subtle pulse of distant stars. The story of the hills is often told as a sequence of events that drive the lights, the craft, the hypnosis, the public revelations. But for them, it was also a story of perception. Each night became a meditation on the edges of understanding. Each glance at the heavens, a reminder of the mystery lingering just beyond the familiar. And as they moved through the years, interacting with friends, neighbors, researchers, and storytellers sharing their insights, and journalists, they carried with them the soft, persistent rhythm of September 19th. A whisper in the sky that could be ignored, but never entirely forgotten. It is in this rhythm that the true legacy of the encounter lives, not in sensational headlines or dramatic retellings, but in the subtle, pervasive way it reshaped perception. Ordinary people may never witness a hovering craft or an intelligent light in the night, yet they encounter echoes of the hill's experience whenever they pause, look up, and consider the stars. It is an invitation to curiosity, reflection, and the quiet courage to acknowledge that not all experiences fit neatly into explanation. And so the whispers in the sky continue. They do not shout. They do not demand attention. They exist in quiet spaces, in the soft turning of the world, in the moments between one thought and the next. Betty and Barney Hill understood this deeply. Their encounter taught them that the extraordinary often arrives without fanfare. That perception can be as transformative as reality, and that mystery, when approached with care and curiosity, can be a companion rather than a threat. Even now, decades later, the night holds that same gentle insistence. Lights may flicker, dreams may stir, memories may resurface. Unexpectedly, but the Hill's story reminds us that wonder does not need to be loud. It only needs to be noticed. The universe, in all its expanse, offers quiet invitations to observe, to imagine, to question, and sometimes the most profound lessons are those whispered softly above, in the stillness of the sky, where the unknown waits patiently for eyes willing to see. Even the quietest night can carry the soft echo of something extraordinary, waiting just beyond the reach of understanding. Chapter 5. Dreams and the Star Map. Dreams have a way of sneaking in, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and then staying. For Betty Hill, they began as soft disturbances, images that lingered when she woke, fragments of motion and color that didn't belong to her ordinary life. Nights would bring the sensation of being somewhere else, somewhere not fully tangible, but not entirely imagined either. It was as if her mind had opened a door to a room she could not recognize, and each night, more of that room was revealed. The first dreams were small, subtle. She would see a roadblock, not unlike the ones she and Barney had passed on their drive, but this one shimmered with an otherworldly precision. Figures emerged gray, delicate, almost fragile-looking, with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold attention without forcing it. She could feel their gaze, a gentle pressure that seeped into her thoughts. It was not frightening, yet it was impossible to ignore. Something in her body shifted each time she woke. A quickened heartbeat, a flutter in her stomach, a breath that didn't belong to the ordinary rhythm of sleep. Barney's dreams were equally vivid. They were not identical to Betty's, yet they echoed similar sensations, hovering shapes, strange lights, a quiet hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air of the dream. Sometimes he felt as though he were being guided, his own movements directed by a force he could not name. Other times, he floated without control, observing, listening, learning without understanding why. Each morning, he awoke with impressions that defied ordinary explanation. A map of lights in his mind, a precise alignment of points, and lines that seemed impossible to invent. As the dreams grew more insistent, Betty realized they were not merely passing images. They were intricate, detailed, and purposeful. The beings in the dreams conducted what she later described as examinations, not invasive in a cruel sense, but methodical, clinical, and strangely considerate. They were curious about her, as if she were part of a puzzle they sought to understand. Instruments appeared that she could not name, lights and sensors that hummed in synchrony with her heartbeat. And always, there was the sense of instruction, a quiet pull in the mind, a suggestion rather than command, urging her to observe, to remember, to record. It was during one of these dreams that she first glimpsed the star map, a soft, glowing diagram unfolded before her eyes, lines connecting distant points, constellations arranged with precision. Yet unlike any sky she had seen, she could feel the weight of it in her hands, the need to memorize, to reproduce it. When she awoke, the image lingered in her mind like a photograph etched into memory. She reached for paper and pencil, her hands trembling, her heart steady but insistent. She drew the stars as best she could, following the lines and patterns that had appeared in the dream. The arrangement felt unfamiliar, yet familiar, a map both strange and logical, as if drawn by a mind not entirely human but not entirely alien. Barney watched silently as she worked, understanding in the quiet between words that these were not mere fantasies. These were echoes of something real, something that existed beyond the boundaries of sleep and waking. The star map became a bridge. It connected the fleeting impressions of the dreams to the tangible world of memory and observation. It was a puzzle with pieces scattered across consciousness, a challenge to reconstruct not with tools of measurement or calculation, but with patience, focus, and an openness to the unknown. Betty's hand moved steadily over the paper, tracing the points with reverence, each stroke a testament to the persistence of memory. Barney, too, contributed. Though his own recollections were less visual, he remembered sequences of lights, shapes moving in patterns that seemed deliberate. He described the sensations of weightlessness, the hum of energy beneath his skin, the meticulous order of the being's actions. Together, the Hills began to weave a tapestry of experience, dreams converging with memory, observation merging with imagination, until the story of that night, both waking and sleeping, began to take form. Hypnosis sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon revealed even more layers. Under guided suggestion, separated to prevent influence on one another. Betty and Barney recounted details with astonishing consistency. Barney spoke of beings roughly 5 feet tall, with pear-shaped heads and large, emotionless eyes. He described the sensation of being studied, not in cruelty, but in a precise, intentional manner, as though each motion and reaction mattered. Betty recalled a leader communicating in a soft, murmuring language, testing her understanding and encouraging her to respond. She spoke of instruments, needles, and skin samples, and finally, of the star map that had lingered in her dreams. The star map, reproduced from memory, became a focal point for both believers and skeptics. Amateur astronomer Marjorie Fish would later attempt to match it to actual star systems, proposing the Zeta Reticuli system as a potential origin. Scientists debated its significance, some arguing coincidence, others suggesting an extraordinary connection. For the Hills, however, the star map was not about proof, it was about memory, about translating an experience that had existed between sleep and wakefulness, between observation and dream. The dreams themselves evolved. Repetition brought clarity, but also emotional intensity. Betty began to recognize patterns, the way the beings moved, the subtle rhythms of their presence, the quiet, almost ceremonial nature of the observations. Barney noticed the way the lights pulsed in a sequence, like a message being transmitted, perhaps not to him, but through him, or to someone else entirely. These nocturnal visions were neither frightening nor comforting. They were instructive, a new language of perception that demanded attention and patience. Even beyond the dreams, the impact seeped into their waking lives, a quiet feeling of awareness, and got a sense that the world was broader, more nuanced, and more interconnected than they had previously understood. Ordinary lights, sounds, and movements gained a new dimension, a flicker in the distance, a ripple of wind. The silent pause of the forest all became reminders that the universe was alive with possibility. It was not threatening. It was expansive, patient, waiting to be noticed. The Hills' neighbors, friends, and colleagues began to notice subtle changes as well. Barney's careful, disciplined nature remained, but there was a new patience in his gaze, a quiet introspection. Betty's warmth and empathy deepened, tempered with an acute sensitivity to nuance and detail. They spoke less of the extraordinary openly, aware that disbelief and skepticism were natural, and yet their lives had shifted in ways that were palpable. The dreams had awakened something in them. Consciousness attuned to the subtle, the unexplained, the quietly remarkable. Over time, these dreams and the star map forged a bridge between personal experience and cultural imagination. They inspired books, articles, discussions, and even cinematic depictions. The Hills encounter became a reference point, not merely for UFO enthusiasts, but for anyone intrigued by the boundary between perception and reality, memory and imagination, sleep and waking. It illustrated the delicate balance between skepticism and belief, encouraging a gentle curiosity that could coexist with reason. And yet, even as their story spread, the essence of the dreams remained intimate, private, and unshareable in full. Only those who experienced the quiet insistence of the unknown, who allowed themselves to linger in the space between certainty and doubt, could understand the subtle depth of their vision. The star map, the instruments, the beings, and the missing hours were markers. Signposts on a path that led as much inward as outward. They demanded not just attention, but reflection, patience, and a willingness to inhabit the mystery without resolution. Betty and Barney understood that the dreams were not endings, they were invitations. Invitations to question, to explore, to hold space for the unexplainable in a world that often demanded clarity. Each night, each memory, each drawing reinforced a profound truth. The extraordinary often arrives quietly, leaving traces not of spectacle, but of perception, awareness, and subtle transformation. In these quiet explorations, the Hills discovered a rhythm of wonder that was gentle but unyielding. Their dreams, their memories, and their star map became a guide, not toward proof, but toward understanding, a framework for contemplating the unknown with patience, curiosity, and a steady heart. And so, the nights continued to hum with possibility. The stars remained constant, yet in their constancy lay subtle invitation for Betty and Barney, and for those who listened carefully. The universe offered whispers of knowledge and awareness that required no dramatics, no alarm-only attention, and the quiet willingness to perceive what might otherwise go unnoticed. Sometimes, the most extraordinary journeys begin not in daylight, but in the soft, insistent quiet of a dream. Chapter 6. The Missing Hours. Time has a way of slipping through fingers when you least expect it, folding in on itself like a quiet secret. For Betty and Barney Hill, the hours between the strange lights over the White Mountains and their sudden reappearance near Ashland were no ordinary passage of time. They vanished, not just from memory, but from the very rhythm of their lives. Klex insisted that hours had passed, yet their minds held only fragments, fleeting impressions, and a strange sense of dislocation. The drive home on September 19th had begun like any other. The couple had chatted about the vacation, laughed about small incidents at Niagara Falls, and felt the calm familiarity of each other's company. But as the dark road stretched before them, lined with ancient pines that leaned toward the moonlit asphalt, a point of light appeared in the distance. It moved differently than any star or plane. It seemed alive, attentive, responsive, aware. Betty noticed first, and Barney, ever the rational mind, tried to explain it away. Yet, as the light shifted, changed intensity, and drew closer, the ordinary explanations fell apart. They stopped the car, again and again, each halt marking the beginning of a sequence that would remain unbroken in its strangeness. Then the impossible happened. The craft hovered above them, 8 to 11 figures visible in the windows. The air was thick with a quiet, almost tactile hum. Barney felt it pressing lightly against his chest, an unspoken demand that he remain still. And then, without warning, the missing hours began. They could not recall the journey. The memory picked up later, 35 miles south, near Ashland. The physical evidence confirmed the interruption. Watches that stopped permanently, a dress torn and sprinkled with an odd pink powder, scuffed shoes, and circular marks on the car that disrupted compass needles. Yet none of these signs explained the passage of time itself. Where had they been? What had occurred? The missing hours became a silent companion in their minds. Each day, subtle reminders of that night emerged. The humming sensation that sometimes lingered in quiet rooms. The inexplicable sense that someone or something was watching just beyond sight. The subtle tension in muscles and breath that could not be shaken. They carried this companion with them like a shadow, present yet intangible. Betty's dreams began to overlap with memory. They were not mere figments of imagination, but fragments of experience, woven with the emotional weight of the unknown. She dreamed of roadblocks illuminated by soft, ambient light, of gray-skinned beings moving around them with careful deliberation. There were instruments, delicate and intricate, and procedures that felt clinical yet oddly considerate. Each time she awoke, a sense of incompleteness remained, as though the dream had shown only part of the story. Barney's recollections followed a similar pattern. In his dreams, he floated above and beside himself, observing, sometimes participating, often helpless to intervene. Lights pulsed rhythmically, moving in patterns he could not name. Shapes and forms hovered, not threatening, but commanding attention. He could feel their gaze, a sensation that penetrated without touching, an awareness that was neither hostile nor gentle but undeniably present. In 1963, driven by a growing need for clarity, they sought the help of Dr. Benjamin Simon. Hypnosis sessions offered the first sustained glimpse into those lost hours. Betty and Barney were guided into states of deep relaxation, memory, and focus, where fragments began to reassemble themselves. They were interviewed separately, ensuring that one's recollections would not influence the other. Yet their accounts emerged with an uncanny alignment. Barney described being stopped at a roadblock manned by beings whose large, dark eyes seemed to search his thoughts. He felt compelled to comply with instructions he did not hear aloud, but understood instinctively. The experience was disorienting yet precise, as though every movement and reaction had a purpose he could not articulate. Betty recalled similar experiences. The quiet guidance of the leader, the soft murmuring of an unfamiliar language, and the testing of her responses. She remembered examinations, measurements, and instruments that glimmered with an almost liquid light. And then, the star map, a constellation chart that would later capture the attention of researchers around the world. She traced the lines and points in her mind, as if they were keys to understanding the larger journey of that night. The missing hours were not solely about fear or confusion. They carried with them a sense of discovery, of being in the presence of something larger, something carefully observing, recording, and interacting with the human mind. Both Betty and Barney reported feelings of awe intermingled with terror, not the terror of imminent harm, but the deep, reverent recognition of an experience that defied ordinary comprehension. Outside observers struggled to reconcile these gaps. Investigators from NECAP, Project Blue Book, and later, MUFON meticulously documented their reports. Radar tracks, witness statements, and physical anomalies lent credibility to the event. Yet the central mystery, the missing time itself, remained unresolved. Scientists, psychologists, and skeptics debated whether these lost hours could be explained through stress, memory distortion, or hallucinatory experiences. Yet for the Hills, these explanations could not touch the reality of the sensations, the dreams, and the star map that remained vivid in their minds. The missing hours also began to influence their daily lives. Subtle habits shifted. They would check the car for marks, their watches for strange behavior, and often paused to reflect on fleeting sensations that reminded them of that night. Conversations would linger on small, unusual details. The way a light reflected off a surface, the unexpected hum of an electrical device, the fleeting impression of shapes just beyond vision. The ordinary world had gained layers of quiet significance. Their story, as it slowly emerged, revealed more than abduction or anomaly. It demonstrated how human perception, memory, and consciousness interact with the unknown. The missing hours were a window into that intersection, a place where linear time bent, where memory became fluid, and where the mind both preserved and concealed experiences too complex to be understood immediately. Betty and Barney's courage lay not in solving the mystery, but in sharing it. Despite societal pressures, disbelief, and the potential for ridicule, they recounted their experiences in painstaking detail. Their commitment allowed others to explore, question, and reflect on the nature of the unknown. Through interviews, hypnosis sessions, and eventual publication, the missing hours became a case study in the fragility and resilience of memory, in the intersection of trauma and wonder, and in the ways ordinary lives encounter the extraordinary. The quiet aftermath of those hours also shaped the Hills' emotional world. Barney's disciplined, rational demeanor was tempered by an openness to experience that had previously been less pronounced. He spoke often of patterns in the night sky, of subtle shifts in perception, and of the importance of attentiveness to small, almost imperceptible signals. Betty's empathy deepened, her sensitivity to nuance and emotional resonance heightened. Both found themselves attuned to the subtleties of experience, but many overlooked the tiny glimmer of possibility that exists between certainty and doubt. These missing hours, though unaccounted for by conventional measures of time, expanded the boundaries of what it meant to live fully in the moment. They introduced a rhythm that alternated between awareness and reflection, observation and imagination. In that reaction, the Hills discovered a quiet power, the ability to inhabit uncertainty, to live with questions that had no immediate answers, and to find meaning in the gentle unfolding of events. In sharing their story, the Hills invited the world to consider the possibility that time, perception, and memory are not as rigid as they seem. The missing hours were not merely lost. They were a lesson in attention, patience, and the subtle ways the universe communicates. For those who listened carefully, who allowed themselves to linger in the gentle currents of curiosity, the tale became not just a story of abduction, but a meditation on existence, awareness, and the delicate interplay between the known and the unknown. The missing hours remain, in many ways, a quiet testament to the limits of understanding. They remind us that even the most ordinary lives can intersect with events that stretch comprehension, that touch the mind and spirit in ways words cannot fully capture. They are an invitation to notice the subtle, to honor the fleeting, and to hold space for the extraordinary within the ordinary. And so, the story of the missing hours endures not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a quiet mirror reflecting the depths of human perception, the persistence of memory, and the gentle persistence of wonder in a world that often demands certainty. Sometimes, the moments we cannot remember hold the deepest truths of all. Chapter 7. Shadows in the Mind. The mind is a fragile, intricate landscape. It holds memories like delicate threads, sometimes clear and strong, sometimes fraying at the edges. For Betty and Barney Hill, the events of that September night in 1961 began to weave themselves into the shadowed corners of their consciousness, in ways they could not yet name. They awoke to the ordinary world, yet beneath the surface, something extraordinary had quietly settled. The first mornings after the drive were ordinary in their motions. Breakfasts were prepared, mail sorted, errands completed. Yet there was an invisible weight pressing on both of them, a subtle distortion, like the feeling of stepping into a room just after someone is left, the air still humming with presence. Words sometimes faltered. Conversations occasionally hung in the quiet before resuming. Even the familiar comfort of each other's presence felt different, touched by the unknown. Betty began to notice dreams that refused to dissipate with daylight. They returned with startling clarity, night after night. The beings in these dreams were always there, moving with calm efficiency, never cruel, yet undeniably intentional. They guided, observed, and sometimes seemed to study not Betty alone, but both of them. The two threads of their lives entwined with something larger. In the daylight, she found herself thinking of these visions often. The lines between memory, imagination, and dream blurred. She would pause during household tasks, staring at a corner of the ceiling or the pattern of shadows on the floor, as if expecting the presence from her dreams to manifest again. Barney noticed these moments too and felt a quiet empathy, sharing in the sense of something just beyond reach. Barney, disciplined and rational, struggled with these fragments of perception. He wanted to label, measure, understand, and dismiss them, but the experiences were persistent, defying conventional explanation. In his quieter moments, he would replay the drive, the lights, the figures in the craft. He would touch his watch, now forever stopped, and feel the odd compulsion that time itself had shifted. He could almost sense the lost hours folding back into memory, teasing him with glimpses of experiences he could not fully grasp. The missing hours and the dreams created a rhythm that neither could escape. Each day, they moved through ordinary routines while carrying the extraordinary beneath their skin, as if part of their nervous system had become attuned to signals invisible to others. Their sense of reality expanded in quiet increments. A distant hum, a flash of light in the corner of vision, or a fleeting shadow outside the window could momentarily conjure the intensity of that night, folding the years back into a single pulse of awareness. And yet, despite the strangeness, they both found ways to anchor themselves. Work, community, and social responsibilities acted as stabilizing forces. Betty's care for others, Barney's commitment to justice, and their shared devotion to each other became the steady center around which these anomalies swirled. Their love and mutual trust allowed them to navigate the uncertainty together, to bear the weight of what they had seen, even when the meaning remained elusive. Then came the subtle signs that hinted at the deeper truths hidden in those missing hours. Barney would sometimes recall fragments of movement, his own gestures, the arrangement of the beings, the glow of instruments, but these recollections were fleeting, elusive, and always incomplete. Betty would awaken from dreams with star maps etched in her mind, constellations that felt familiar yet otherworldly, a language of the sky she had never studied but now remembered with astonishing detail. This intersection of memory, dream, and perception fascinated researchers later. Before the Hills, it was lived reality. They could not separate the practical from the impossible, the mundane from the cosmic. Each instance of remembrance, no matter how brief, was a reminder that life had been subtly, irrevocably altered that night. Hypnosis became a tool of gentle exploration, a way to navigate the shadows of memory. Dr. Benjamin Simon guided them into deep states where the layers of the mind could unfold, layer by layer. Barney, initially skeptical and hesitant, discovered that he could relive moments from the night with astonishing vividness. The roadblock, the craft, the beings all emerged with precise clarity. He recalled their gestures, the sequence of movements, even the strange mechanical sounds that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Betty, equally cautious, yet curious, found the sessions both revealing and unnerving. The sensations she had only glimpsed in dreams now unfolded as structured sequences. She could describe procedures, instruments, and even the soft hum of voices, communicating in a language she could not fully translate. The star map, which had seemed a product of imagination, now appeared in these sessions with the same details, line for line, point for point. Through these explorations, a pattern emerged. The experiences were not random. They were ordered, precise, deliberate. Yet the order did not conform to earthly logic. It was as if time itself had been rearranged, condensed, or expanded, folding the Hills' consciousness into an experience that was both personal and ineffably vast. Outside the sessions, the couple adapted to this new reality. They spoke carefully, choosing words that conveyed their experiences without inviting disbelief or ridicule. Yet their interactions with friends and neighbors were inevitably colored by subtle shifts in demeanor. Pauses became longer. Eyes lingered on objects with an almost instinctive curiosity. Conversations occasionally stumbled into the realm of the extraordinary, though always cautiously. This quiet alteration of perception became a defining feature of their lives. The Hills were not haunted by terror. They were attuned to possibility. Every shadow, every light, every faint sound carried the potential for meaning beyond the immediately visible. And in that attunement, they found a kind of reverent stillness, a calm vigilance that transformed ordinary moments into portals of quiet wonder. Researchers studying the case later noted the consistency between Betty and Barney's recollections. The hypnotic sessions revealed that even separated by distance and time, the couple's memories of the missing hours aligned in detail. This consistency, juxtaposed with the gaps and omissions, created a unique puzzle. The missing hours were tangible in effect, yet ethereal in content, bridging the boundary between conscious perception and memory, between reality and the threshold of dream. The shadows in the mind were not only about fear or confusion, they were about awareness. They illustrated how humans respond to experiences that defy conventional understanding. Memory stretches, reshapes, and sometimes conceals, yet it also preserves fragments with meticulous care. Dreams, hypnosis, and intuition became tools to access what had been hidden, revealing a world layered within the familiar, quiet moments of daily life. In quiet reflection, the Hills realized that these shadows were not enemies. They were guides, subtle indicators that the ordinary world contained extraordinary threads. The missing hours had left impressions, faint yet undeniable, on the very structure of their attention, perception, and emotional resonance. Each day offered glimpses, and in those glimpses lay the profound realization that reality is more complex than it appears, and that the human mind is capable of navigating, recording, and responding to phenomena that transcend conventional explanation. By embracing these shadows, Betty and Barney demonstrated courage not in confronting visible danger, but in living fully with the invisible. They allowed themselves to explore uncertainty without fear, to examine memory without judgment, and to witness the extraordinary in the quiet, ordinary flow of life. Their story was no longer only about lights in the sky. It became about how humans perceive, process, and integrate events that challenge their understanding. The missing hours and the shadows in the mind became a bridge to broader questions. How does consciousness interact with unknown forces? How do trauma, attention, and memory converge when faced with events that defy the everyday? What is the line between experience and recollection, between reality and perception? These questions remained unanswered, yet they shaped the Hills' lives and the culture that eventually studied their story. And so, as the years passed, the shadows in the mind remained a quiet, persistent presence. They were not frightening, nor were they fully comprehensible. They were reminders of the delicate, subtle ways in which extraordinary experiences leave traces on the human psyche. Each recollection, each dream, each moment of unaccountable awareness was a whisper from the missing hours, inviting contemplation, curiosity, and wonder. Betty and Barney's willingness to navigate these shadows, to share fragments with the world, created a legacy that extends far beyond the specifics of one night in New Hampshire. Their story became a mirror, reflecting the limits and resilience of human perception, the layers of consciousness, and the quiet persistence of questions that have no immediate answers. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, if one listens carefully, it is possible to feel the gentle echo of those missing hours. Reminder that some experiences are so vast, so intricate, that they cannot be contained by the ordinary measures of time, space, or memory. The mind holds its secrets in the quietest corners, waiting for patience, attention, and gentle curiosity to uncover them. Chapter 8. The Star Map and the Silent Language. Night had a different rhythm for Betty now. Even in her sleep, the universe whispered its riddles, folding space and time into shapes that seemed almost familiar. After the hypnosis sessions began, fragments of the night returned in patterns, in symbols, and most hauntingly, in a map of stars that had etched itself into her mind as though she had been born knowing it. It wasn't a map of any territory she had ever studied yet. It felt profound, undeniable, like a secret left for her to understand. The first time she saw it clearly, she held a pencil over a blank piece of paper and began to trace the points. At first, the lines wavered, unsure, hesitant. But as her hand moved, guided by memory and intuition, the arrangement of stars became precise, almost mechanical in its perfection. She paused, staring at the constellation-like formation, sensing a hidden logic. It was as if the universe had extended a quiet hand, inviting her to see what had been shown so briefly on that night. Barney watched her in silence, initially unsure of what to make of this star chart. He was practical, grounded in discipline, and yet even he could not deny the intensity of Betty's focus, or the consistency with which the patterns emerged. "It's not from any atlas we've ever seen," he murmured, tracing a finger along the lines she had drawn. "It's somewhere else, somewhere beyond." Together, they began to explore the map, the shapes, and the possibilities it suggested. Nights that had once passed in ordinary darkness were now filled with quiet wonder, the two of them studying points of light, tracing constellations, and wondering about distances that the human mind could barely imagine. They were not astronomers, yet the map became a language, a silent message etched across the stars. The silent language extended beyond the map. In dreams and hypnosis sessions, Betty recalled small, geometric shapes that glimmered faintly in her mind's eye. They were not words, but communication nonetheless, as though intention could be conveyed without speech. Barney described similar experiences, lights pulsing rhythmically, gestures that carried meaning, and sounds that were not sounds, but impressions, filling his consciousness like a tide of understanding without form. The two began to discuss what these experiences meant. They did not leap to conclusions about extraterrestrial origin or psychological phenomena. Instead, they considered the patterns, the consistency, and the profound precision of what they remembered. "If this is a map," Betty whispered one evening, "then someone or something wanted us to see it. They wanted us to notice the connections." Barney nodded, feeling the same quiet awe. He could not explain the sensations, the impressions, the detailed memories that had emerged only under hypnosis, but he recognized the significance of it. Even if he did not fully understand, he had witnessed something remarkable, something that demanded reflection, patience, and careful observation. As days turned into weeks, the Hills realized that the star map and silent language were not isolated events. They were part of a broader experience that had altered their perception of the night, the sky, and the delicate interplay between human consciousness and the unknown. Small, subtle cues in their daily lives began to take on new meaning. The hum of electricity in a distant power line, the shimmer of light through trees, or the exact angle of a shadow on the wall, each could trigger a memory, a sensation, or an insight into what had occurred. The phenomenon of the star map also drew the attention of Marjorie Fish, an amateur astronomer, devoted herself to studying the arrangement Betty had drawn. She mapped nearby star systems and proposed a connection to the Zeta Reticuli system, a binary star pair far beyond the solar system. Whether coincidence or design, the alignment suggested something that challenged ordinary understanding. Perhaps the memory was more than symbolic. Perhaps it was a literal depiction of a distant place, presented with painstaking accuracy by a mind under subtle guidance. This realization added layers of complexity to the Hill's experience. It was no longer merely a story of light and missing time. It became a story of communication, of intelligence, beyond the immediate and familiar. The map, the shapes, the silent impressions, they all pointed to an awareness operating on a plane that humans could perceive but only dimly comprehend. The experience of seeing, remembering, and attempting to decode the star map also brought with it moments of emotional intensity. Betty would often pause, her eyes tracing the dots and lines with quiet reverence, and feel an uncanny warmth, as though a presence lingered in the room. Barney would place a steadying hand on hers, both recognizing the simultaneous comfort and weight of the moment. The map was not frightening, but it carried a significance that demanded respect. It also provoked reflection. If intelligence could reach across space, across consciousness, and embed understanding within memory itself, what did that imply about the nature of communication, awareness, and the cosmos? The Hills did not claim to have all the answers. They did not assert that the map revealed ultimate truth. They only observed, recorded, and shared what they could perceive. The silent language and star map became threads woven into the larger fabric of their lives. It informed the way they viewed the world, the stars, and even each other. Moments of quiet conversation often drifted into speculation about patterns, intentions, and meaning. And yet, the experience never tipped into certainty, preserving a delicate balance between wonder and humility. In subtle ways, the map also shaped the Hills' interactions with others. Researchers, journalists, and friends who encountered the story were drawn not only to the encounter itself, but also to the map's tangible presence. It was evidence that something had occurred that could not easily be dismissed. It was a bridge between human experience and the unfathomable. A reminder that some truths exist just beyond the edge of comprehension, waiting to be traced, understood, and respected. One evening, as the Hills gazed at the night sky from their backyard, the quiet hum of the world around them seemed to mirror the precision of the map. Stars glittered in patterns that echoed faintly in memory, reinforcing the strange symmetry of their experience. Betty pointed to a small cluster far above the horizon. "I think this is where they wanted me to look," she said softly. Barney nodded, feeling that same quiet resonance, the echo of that September night stretching across the decades. The star map and silent language also shaped dreams. Betty's sleep became an exploration of the cosmos, a delicate dance of perception and memory. She would awaken with the constellations still vivid, carrying the sense that she had glimpsed something real, something that existed beyond the limitations of ordinary vision. Barney shared similar experiences, fragmented impressions, fleeting glimmers of meaning, yet always consistent with the structure of the events. It was in this interplay of dreaming and memory that the Hills discovered one of the most profound aspects of their encounter. The human mind can perceive, store, and recall experiences that defy immediate explanation. Consciousness, when stretched across fear, wonder, and the unknown, becomes capable of remarkable retention, mapping both reality and the intangible with equal clarity. And yet, the map was not a puzzle to solve entirely. It was an invitation to wonder, a quiet challenge to explore, question, and contemplate. Its presence reminded the Hills, and later the world, that some mysteries are not meant to be reduced to simple answers. They exist to expand awareness, to test perception, and to evoke reflection on the delicate boundary between the known and the unknown. For years, the star map and silent language remained central to the Hill narrative. It became an emblem of their experience, a tangible trace of something vast, deliberate, and extraordinary. The story was no longer just about lights, abduction, or missing time. It was about connection, memory, and the threads that bind human consciousness to mysteries beyond immediate understanding. In quiet moments, the Hills would sometimes imagine that the stars themselves were acknowledging the map. Shimmering in subtle alignment, as if affirming the presence of intelligence that had reached across unimaginable distances. It was a comfort, a reminder that even in the vast expanse of space, patterns exist, intentions persist, and the human mind can touch what is beyond comprehension. The silent language was never fully translated. Its rhythm, its cadence, and its significance remained largely a mystery. And perhaps that was the point. Some communications do not require literal understanding to be meaningful. The act of perception, of noticing, of tracing lines and points, was itself a form of engagement with the unknown, a meditation on possibility, curiosity, and the quiet reverence for what lies beyond. By engaging with these elements, the Hills exemplified a rare openness to the extraordinary. They did not seek to impose narrative over their experience. They did not claim mastery or understanding. They simply observed, reflected, and allowed the impressions to deepen their awareness, transforming ordinary nights into quiet explorations of wonder and meaning. The star map and silent language became a guide not only to the events of that September night, but to a larger understanding of consciousness, memory, and the subtle ways in which extraordinary phenomena leave traces in human perception. They were invitations to notice. Even today, if one studies Betty Hill's drawings, traces the connections, and allows space for contemplation, a faint echo of that night can be felt, a reminder that some experiences transcend the ordinary and that the human mind can quietly hold the imprints of something vast, deliberate, and luminous. Some mysteries arrive not in words, but in quiet constellations and the soft hum of awareness. Chapter 9: The Forest, the Road, and the Quiet Witnesses. The White Mountains held their own stories long before humans wandered through them. Their peaks rose like silent guardians, and their valleys carried echoes of wind, wildlife, and secrets that could only be perceived in the hush between breaths. To drive through them at night was to step into a realm where ordinary life softened at the edges, where shadows seemed deeper, and even familiar roads could feel uncharted. For Betty and Barney Hill, that night in September 1961 transformed one such road into a threshold. U.S. Route 3 stretched before them, dark and still, curving through Franconia notched like a ribbon of memory that would never fade. Every bend, every shadowed tree, seemed charged with anticipation, and every sound, the whisper of tires over asphalt, the rustle of unseen leaves, felt amplified. The forest was alive in its silence, and the hills, attentive and weary from their vacation, sensed a presence that went beyond ordinary perception. Betty's first glimpse of the light had been subtle, almost accidental, a flicker at the corner of her eye, a shimmer among the stars that seemed to deliver it to be natural. When she mentioned it, Barney's rational mind insisted on explanations. A plane, a satellite, something mundane. But as the minutes passed, the rationale explanations unraveled. The light did not move like a plane. It darted, hesitated, and hovered. It responded to them, to the movement of the car, to their pulses, to their very gaze. The closer they approached, the more the forest seemed to hold its breath. The trees leaned in, shadows stretching, and the cold night air carried a stillness that felt almost tangible. Barney's hand tightened on the steering wheel, his muscles alert, sensing tension in the space around him. Betty, gripping the binoculars, felt a thrill of fear and wonder mingle in a way that left her chest tight. Her thoughts fragmented between logic and instinct. They stopped the car multiple times, each pause revealing new layers of the impossible. From a distance, the object resembled a simple light, a floating dot against the darkness. Up close, however, it was a craft with shape and intention, windows and multicolored luminescence rippling around its edges. It hovered, rotated slightly, and remained astonishingly still despite the wind and terrain. Barney was the first to notice the figures within. They were small, humanoid shapes, standing behind the windows, their movements minimal but deliberate. There was no malice, but a presence that could not be ignored, a careful observation, a silent awareness of the hills themselves. The forest seemed to accommodate them, the darkness wrapping around the craft as if the trees and shadows conspired to frame the encounter perfectly. Then came the command, not spoken aloud, but pressed into Barney's consciousness with the subtlety of a breeze that suddenly weighs down the chest. "Stay where you are." His knees weakened, his grip faltered, and yet he obeyed instinctively. The world narrowed to the moment, to the object, to the strange figures behind its windows. Fear was present, but alongside it existed a peculiar fascination, a sense of being witness to something profoundly deliberate, quietly orchestrated, and beyond immediate understanding. The beeping followed a rhythmic, mechanical sound that seemed almost musical in its repetition. It washed over them, pulling at the edges of their awareness, blending time and perception into a haze where moments stretched and folded, and then the dark blank of missing time swallowed them whole. When they recovered, they were miles away. Ashland appeared like a place both familiar and unreal. The road under their tires felt ordinary. Yet every detail from the stopped watches to Barney's scuffed shoes whispered of an interruption that defied explanation. Betty's torn dress, faintly dusted with pink powder, seemed like a residue of another dimension, a tangible memory of the hours they could not account for. The forest remained a silent witness, its branches arching over the path as if to mark the event in the fabric of the night. No human eyes had observed it. No other cars interrupted the journey, yet the landscape itself carried the imprint of what had transpired. The white mountains, timeless and vast, held the story in their shadows, a repository of the extraordinary nestled within the ordinary. In the weeks that followed, the Hills began to notice other signs, subtle and persistent, that the encounter had changed them. The quiet of the night seemed sharper, more attentive. Sounds carried differently. Shadows seemed to hint at motion where none existed. Evente wind, brushing through leaves, carried a cadence that suggested rhythm and awareness. They were no longer just observers. The night had imprinted upon them, subtly teaching attention, patience, and the acceptance of uncertainty. When they recounted the story to researchers, the details of the forest and the road became as significant as the craft itself. Investigators visited the site, tracing the same curves of asphalt, the same turns in the trees, noting how the isolation amplified both fear and clarity. Even in daylight, the roads held an uncanny resonance, and the way sunlight filtered through the treetops mirrored the patterns of shadows the Hills remembered from that night. Their experience also underscored the importance of context in perception. Alone in a car on a dark highway, surrounded by dense forest, the human mind can focus with extraordinary intensity. Every movement, every light, every subtle sound becomes amplified, creating a stage upon which extraordinary events can unfold. Yet the Hills' observations were not products of imagination alone. The consistency between their accounts, combined with physical anomalies and later corroborative studies, suggested that the forest and the road had indeed hosted a convergence of human and unknown experience. The forest was patient and neutral. It offered no judgment, no narrative, only presence. In that way, it became part of the story itself, an accomplice in quiet observation. Branches moved in accordance with wind, yet seemed to pause when the craft descended. Shadows stretched and shifted, interacting with the glow of lights in ways that could not be purely natural. The road itself became a conduit, a channel along which perception and reality converged. Barney and Betty learned to read the subtleties of the environment, to notice rhythms that had previously gone unnoticed. A flicker of light between trees, a reflection along the asphalt, or the distant hoot of an owl could trigger memory, emotion, or insight. The forest was no longer merely a backdrop. It had become a participant in the unfolding mystery, shaping experience as much as the craft or the beings themselves. As they walked portions of the road later, retracing their route in daylight, the Hills could almost sense the echoes of the night. They imagined the positions of the craft, the placement of the figures, the path of light, and even the rhythm of beeps. The forest remained unchanged, yet in memory it seemed to vibrate with silent recollection. The trees, the rocks, the curve of the road, everything held fragments of what had happened, waiting for the mind to connect the dots. The white mountains, in their enduring stillness, became a teacher in patience and observation. The Hills discovered that ordinary places could host extraordinary moments, and that the ordinary itself could become a lens for perceiving the impossible. Night after night, their reflections returned to the same thought, that the world, in its quiet expanse, had a way of folding mystery into daily life, of hiding profound experiences within familiar landscapes. And in that quiet reflection, the Hills also found resilience. They understood that memory, perception, and experience could be fragile, yet they were capable of remarkable clarity when observed carefully, without hurry, without panic. The forest had shown them patience, the road had shown them rhythm, and the unseen presence had shown them the depth of attention that the mind could achieve when confronted with the inexplicable. Even decades later, those who drove through Franconia Notch at night reported subtle impressions of that moment. The road, lined with stoic trees, seemed to carry a weight, a quiet energy. Travelers would pause, feeling a strange attentiveness in the shadows, as if the forest remembered something unspoken, something extraordinary, woven into the fabric of the night. For Betty and Barney, the forest and the road were forever intertwined with the experience of that September evening. They had witnessed not just lights and figures, but the subtle choreography of an encounter that blended human perception with the unknown. The lessons of observation, patience, and quiet attentiveness became part of their lives, a gentle but persistent thread connecting the extraordinary with the ordinary. In the end, the night, the forest, and the road were witnesses in a way that no one else could be. They remained silent, impartial, and enduring, holding the memory of what had happened in their stillness, offering it only to those willing to notice, to pause, and to wonder. The road through the mountains remains quiet tonight, waiting for those who will notice its stories. Chapter 10. The Dreams That Carried Them. Nights have a way of bending reality, of folding memory and imagination into a single, fluid experience. For Betty Hill, sleep became a delicate journey between the conscious and the hidden, a bridge that carried fragments of the September night she could not otherwise recall. She would lie down, feeling the familiar comfort of her bedroom, the soft hum of the heater, the distant whisper of the wind through the trees, and yet the peace was always fleeting. The darkness behind her eyelids was no longer merely a canvas for dreams. It became a stage where events long buried tried to speak. The first dream arrived 10 days after their drive through the White Mountains. It began subtly, like a faint echo from a distance, a murmur she almost ignored. Yet, as she drifted deeper, the vision sharpened. She saw the road once more, the stretch of asphalt lined by towering trees, and in the distance, the faint, impossible glow that had followed them. She walked or perhaps floated along the same path, but something had shifted. The light was closer now. Not a dot in the sky, but a presence, a deliberate watcher. Gray figures emerged from it, moving slowly, deliberately. Their forms were neither threatening nor friendly. They simply existed, radiating calm and curiosity, observing without interference. Betty could feel their attention without seeing eyes, as if her thoughts themselves were acknowledged and mirrored. She reached out, but there was no physical sensation, only the impression of touch, soft yet insistent, like a gentle brush against her consciousness. Barney's dreams followed similar paths, though colored differently. His sleep was punctuated by the sensation of motion, of being lifted, carried, guided. In the rhythm of the beeps and the soft hum of the craft, he felt weightless. The fear mingled with awe. He remembered seeing the figure small, pear-shaped air, movements precise and, most strikingly, the eyes. The eyes seemed to penetrate beyond physicality, not to judge or harm, but to understand. Every detail felt imprinted in his mind, vivid and undeniable. These dreams were not fleeting imaginings. They were layered, intricate, and insistently detailed. They revealed the missing time in ways that the waking mind could not process. Doors of cold metal, softly humming instruments, corridors lined with panels of lights and symbols. Each element returned night after night, persistent as a pulse. Betty remembered fragments of conversation, strange murmurs she could not interpret, yet that felt like language shaped for her understanding. The leader appeared in several dreams, an enigmatic figure guiding events with quiet precision. With each night, the dreams became more structured, more like memories than visions. Betty began to recall the examination sequences of probes, the lights, the careful observation of her movements and reactions. She could almost feel the sensations, the coolness of the metal under her fingertips, the hum of machinery vibrating through the floor, the odd yet fascinating smells of an environment entirely foreign. And then there was the star map, etched in her memory, intricate and precise, forming constellations that seemed to pulse with meaning. Barney's dreams mirrored hers in surprising ways. He recalled sequences of motion, the approach of the craft, the precise positioning near the car, the figures visible in the windows. Every detail he described the way the craft hovered, the cadence of the beeping, the shifts of light along the edges matched her recollections under hypnosis later. The alignment was uncanny, the similarities too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Together, the dreams became a form of unspoken communication, a shared experience that extended beyond the physical, threading their minds through a tapestry of recollection and wonder. They spoke carefully to each other about fragments, aware that the unconscious mind could betray through suggestion, yet both sensed the truth lingering beneath the surface. The dreams carried evidence, but not in ways conventional understanding could immediately validate. In the quiet hours of the night, the dreams offered more than just recollection, they offered insight into perception itself. Betty noticed how the mind could layer fear and curiosity simultaneously, how the imagination and memory could converge into clarity. She felt emotions not as abstract concepts, but as physical presences in her chest, her muscles, her breath. Barney experienced something similar, a blending of awe and trepidation that left him both vulnerable and acutely aware. Sleep had become a lens through which reality itself refracted, revealing dimensions beyond the ordinary. The repetition of the dreams also shaped their waking lives. Betty found herself attuned to patterns in the sky, noticing shifts in starlight, subtle changes in air pressure, the cadence of nocturnal sounds. Barney developed a meticulous awareness of space and movement, both in the forested roads they traveled and in mundane environments. Every detail, however small, carried potential significance. Their dreams taught them observation as a practice, as a form of participation in a universe that often felt larger than comprehension. Psychologists and researchers later noted that such dreams, especially when emerging after trauma or intense experiences, could represent the mind's attempt to organize and process events that evade ordinary understanding. Yet in the Hills case, the consistency, detail, and shared narrative of the dream suggested something extraordinary, something beyond conventional psychological explanation. These dreams were neither random nor entirely imagined. They carried patterns, symbols, and sequences that demanded attention and study. Betty's star map, born in dreams and recalled under hypnosis, became a focal point. Amateur astronomers, intrigued by the accuracy and structure, proposed a connection to the Zeta Reticuli system, suggesting that the information embedded in her unconscious mind might have been derived from knowledge beyond Earth. While skeptics argued randomness or suggestion, the map's precision and her vivid recall became a cornerstone of the case, demonstrating how dreams could serve as vessels for both memory and mystery. Barney, too, contributed through detailed recountings of motion and observation, describing the internal layout of the craft, the behavior of the figures, and the sequences of events with remarkable consistency. The dreams acted as guides, shaping his recollection into coherent narratives that could be studied, analyzed, and compared. They revealed not only what happened, but how perception itself was influenced by extraordinary experience. The Hills came to recognize that the dreams were both burden and gift. They brought fear. Certainly the emotional intensity was undeniable, but they also brought understanding, a framework for grasping events that had no immediate explanation. In the calm of reflection, they realized that the mind could carry truths too complex for waking consciousness. Alone, dreams became a medium, translating experience into symbols, sequences, and sensations that could later be articulated with care. Through months of repeated dreaming, the Hills noticed subtle patterns, sequences of light and sound, rhythmic intervals, and gestures that seemed intentional rather than chaotic. Each detail contributed to the larger picture, a mosaic of observation, perception, and memory. The dreams were never simple, yet their complexity was structured, offering a path through the unknown. And so, as each night returned, they surrendered to the rhythm of sleep, trusting the dreams to guide them. They learned patience and attentiveness, realizing that the mind itself could become a tool for understanding phenomena that eluded ordinary measurement. The forest, the road, the craft, and the figures all reappeared in dream sequences, yet with clarity and depth that the 2-day observation could not provide. In retrospect, the dreams taught a quiet lesson about human awareness. Ordinary nights could carry extraordinary meaning. The borders between perception and reality could blur gently, without alarm, leaving only wonder and reflection. The Hill's nightly journeys through shadowed corridors, metallic rooms, and star-strewn visions became a repository for insight, for memory, and for curiosity. Even decades later, Betty spoke of the dreams with reverence and calm. They were never frightening. They were immersive, detailed, and deeply instructive. They taught her to observe, to feel, to perceive beyond ordinary measures. Barney remembered them as moments of intense clarity and awareness, where he understood the scope of what they had encountered, and the subtle ways the human mind processes the extraordinary. Sleep had become their laboratory, the dreams a method of slow discovery, a bridge to truths that reality could not otherwise reveal. They discovered that the boundaries of memory and imagination were porous, and that even when events defied explanation, the mind could translate them into experiences both vivid and comprehensible. And so, the nights passed, each carrying new fragments, each layering onto the previous, building a quiet narrative of extraordinary encounter. The Hills learned to move with the rhythm of their dreams, to extract meaning from what appeared ephemeral, and to honor the subtle interplay of memory, perception, and consciousness. The dreams were not merely recollections. They were invitations to notice, to reflect, to wonder, and to acknowledge that the ordinary world held layers beyond immediate comprehension. They were gifts of understanding, patience, and humility, reminding the Hills, and anyone who would listen, that the universe often whispers its secrets in the quiet moments of observation, in the space between consciousness and sleep, and in the delicate unfolding of the night. The night deepens, carrying the whispers of dreams that speak louder than words ever could. Chapter 11. The Road, the Lights, and the Silent Witnesses. The road stretches endlessly, or so it seems, when darkness has draped itself over the landscape. Franconia Notch is no ordinary highway. It is a ribbon of asphalt threading through mountains that rise like silent sentinels, their peaks obscured by shadows, their slopes lined with trees whose leaves whisper in a wind that no one notices until it brushes past. To travel this road at night is to enter a space that feels suspended, where time slows and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. For Betty and Barney Hill, this road became more than a path home. It became the stage of an event that would echo through decades. It began as an ordinary drive, a return from Niagara Falls in Montreal, the kind of journey filled with light conversation, laughter, and the gentle stretching of muscles after hours on the road. But darkness has a way of revealing things that the day conceals. Somewhere past the familiar markers of towns and signs, a flicker appeared, small, distant, yet persistent. At first, it seemed insignificant, just a point of light among countless stars. But the light moved, and not with the predictable glide of an aircraft. It hovered, shifted, pulsed, as though aware of the travelers below. Betty noticed it first, her gaze drawn instinctively, almost unconsciously, toward the movement in the sky. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, a subtle tension threading through her fingers. "Barney," she murmured, not wanting to break the rhythm of conversation, but unable to ignore the sensation rising in her chest. "Do you see that?" Barney glanced over, his eyes scanning the darkness. His rational mind sought the ordinary, an airplane, a satellite, perhaps the reflection of city lights. But the movement was deliberate, intelligent, and unnerving in its precision. "Probably a plane," he said, though his voice carried the strain of forced calm. His heart, like hers, registered a flicker of unease. The light drew closer. Its movement defied expectation, darting in ways that no aircraft should, stopping mid-door, then resuming with a rhythm that seemed purposeful. The air around the car grew dense with anticipation, the forest silent, as if holding its breath. Each shift in the light made the couple pause, their fingers gripping, their eyes widening. The ordinary drive had slipped into the extraordinary, and there was no turning back. They stopped the car. Then again, and each pause revealed more. The glow was not merely a light, it was a presence, an entity that interacted with them without words. Betty, her hands trembling, pulled the binoculars from the dashboard, her breath shallow as she peered at what now appeared to be a craft, pancake-shaped, with windows along its edge. Within those windows, figures moved with a calm deliberation, their forms humanoid, but unlike anything familiar. Colors shifted along the rim of the craft, not erratic, but precise, as though each pulse of light carried meaning. Barney took the binoculars from her, stepping carefully onto the shoulder of the road. The forest seemed to press in around him, quiet yet alive. Every leaf, every shadow, every rustle of the wind felt amplified, as if nature itself had become a participant in this encounter. And then he saw the mate, 211 figures, standing at the windows, watching. One turned its gaze toward him, and the sensation of being observed was immediate, intimate, and disorienting. It reached beyond the eyes, beyond the physical form, brushing against thought itself. The command came next, not in words, but in clarity. Stay where you are. The thought was not external. It was woven directly into perception, a directive that cut through the logic of fear and reason. Barney's chest tightened, breath catching in a sudden gasp. He stumbled back toward the car, words spilling in panic. They're going to capture us. The world narrowed. The road, the trees, the sky all contracting into a single point of focus, the unseen observers above. Then the sound began, a soft, rhythmic beeping, mechanical yet hypnotic. It filled the space around them, entering the mind as much as the ears. Time slipped in strange increments, awareness diluted like ink in water. And then, nothing. Darkness claimed him, and the road, the forest, and the craft vanished. Hours might have passed, or moments. It was impossible to know. When consciousness returned, they were miles away, near Ashland, disoriented, unsure of how they had moved. The car, the road, and the lights remained only in fragmented memory, vivid yet incomprehensible. The aftermath revealed subtle, inexplicable traces of what had occurred. Watchy stopped and never restarted. Barney's shoes bore marks, as if dragged across an unseen surface. Betty's dress was torn, dusted with an unusual pink powder, organic yet defying analysis. The car bore marks that made compasses spin and instruments falter. These anomalies were physical, yet the mind hungered for understanding, searching for coherence in events that brushed against the edges of reason. The night itself became an archive. Memory and perception overlapped, creating layers of reality that could be accessed only through careful reflection. The dreams, which followed, carried these events into a language of imagery and sensation. Nights stretched, filled with motion, lights, and beings whose forms remained consistent in the unconscious minds of both Hills. Each dream was a rehearsal of experience, a reconstruction of events that the waking mind could not fully grasp. Through it all, the forest remained a silent witness. Its trees, its shadows, and the winds weaving through the pines held the memory of movement and presence. Nature had observed, had absorbed the flickers of light and the tremors of fear. Even decades later, the mountains and valleys echoed with an energy that no map could chart, a quiet hum that lingered in the minds of those who remembered. Investigators, years later, pieced together fragments of the journey, using the road, the time, and the locations as coordinates in an unfolding mystery. Lancaster, Franconia, Notch, Indian Head, Ashland. Each site became a node in the map of extraordinary occurrence. The spaces between the missing hours formed a corridor where reason and wonder converged. The journey itself became a framework, a pattern that others would study, debate, and attempt to rationalize. Yet for the Hills, the road was more than geography. It was memory, consciousness, and attention intertwined. Every mile contained layers of perception, the subtle shift of the air, the occasional distant rustle, the way shadows fell under headlights. They realized that being present in observation was as important as recalling the extraordinary. The mind, attuned to detail, became both witness and recorder, capturing nuances that no camera or instrument could fully grasp. The figures in the craft remained silent, their presence devoid of threat but full of awareness. Barney remembered the stillness, the precision of movement, the implied communication conveyed through gestures and posture. Betty noted the patterns of lights, the rhythmic pulses that seemed designed to elicit attention understanding, and reflection. Both sensed intelligence and intent, not malice, yet the awareness itself was overwhelming in its subtlety. These nights, these dreams, and these recollections shaped the Hills' lives in ways both profound and quiet. They became more observant, more attuned to details others might overlook. The ordinary road became a path of subtle revelations, where even the familiar took on a luminous quality when recalled in memory or dream. And as the years unfolded, the echoes of that September night reverberated through their experiences, guiding curiosity, shaping reflection, and embedding wonder into the fabric of their daily lives. Historians and ufologists later examined the sequence of events with meticulous care, tracing every turn, every stop, every light. Radar reports, witness interviews, and Project Blue Book documents created a lattice of evidence, yet the true depth of the experience remained elusive. Physical traces existed, yet the emotional and perceptual dimensions carried weight far beyond the measurable. The road, the lights, and the silent witnesses offered a narrative that could be studied, but not fully contained. And so, the road became a metaphor, a corridor between ordinary existence and extraordinary possibility. It was a space where curiosity, fear, wonder, and memory converged, a path both literal and symbolic. The Hills' experience illuminated the quiet power of observation, the mind's capacity to perceive subtle detail, and the ways extraordinary events embed themselves in consciousness. The journey of September 19, 1961, was more than an encounter with lights and figures. It was a movement through layered reality, a lesson in presence and attention, a reminder that even the quietest road at night can contain the seeds of something vast and unknowable. And as decades passed, the memory of that road, those lights, and the silent watchers continued to ripple outward, shaping conversation, research, and imagination. Long after the car had stopped and the mountains had returned to their ordinary slumber, the road holds its silence, and the mountains remember every light that has passed through their shadows. Chapter 12. The Memories Beneath the Mind. Memory is a strange companion. It drifts, like smoke, sometimes thick, sometimes faint, curling around the corners of what we know and believe. For Betty and Barney Hill, memory became both a comfort and a puzzle, a vessel, carrying fragments of a night that refused to be fully explained. Each recollection, each dream, each trace of sensation seemed to carry layers, as if the night of September 19, 1961, had left something embedded in their minds that ordinary waking life could not easily reach. At first, the Hills tried to live as though nothing unusual had occurred. Life demanded it. Bills, work, community obligations, and family routines filled their days. Betty returned to her social work, visiting homes, listening to children, reading the weight in parents' faces, offering calm in lives that often felt chaotic. Barney went to the post office, sorted letters, managed schedules, engaged in local civil rights efforts with careful determination. They laughed, argued, and settled disputes just like anyone else. And yet, beneath the surface, a quiet tension lingered, moments of unease that arose when the wind shifted, when a light glimmered through the trees, or when a dream replayed itself too vividly. Those dreams came first in the form of subtle disturbances. Betty noticed them as fragments at the edges of sleep, a flash of movement, the sensation of floating, the hum of a presence that she could not name. The dreams grew, accumulating details with a relentless persistence, as if the subconscious had a story that could not be silenced. Gray figures appeared with precision, elongated heads, dark eyes, limbs positioned almost deliberately, performing actions that were clinical, yet curious. There was a rhythm to their movements, a choreography of observation that evoked both fascination and unease. Barney experienced similar dreams, though colored by his own perception. For him, the figures were less distant. Their awareness pressed against him, insistent, yet not hostile. He could feel the weight of attention, a psychological presence that transcended ordinary observation. Often, he awoke with his chest tight, his mind racing, recalling fragments of sequences that made little linear sense but resonated with undeniable clarity. Both Hills realized, slowly, that these dreams were more than the product of imagination. They were vivid enough to suggest a hidden narrative, one their conscious minds could not yet access. It was a realization that brought both relief and terror. Relief, because the strange events were not confined to the waking world. They existed in the mind as well, which meant the mind was capable of remembering. Terror, because memory in this state seemed vulnerable, malleable, and beyond control. It was then that they sought the guidance of Dr. Benjamin Simon. He was a psychiatrist known for careful, methodical work, someone who approached hypnosis not as entertainment but as a tool for unlocking layers of memory without suggestion. The Hills were nervous. Of course, hypnosis carried the weight of uncertainty. It demanded trust in a process that could reveal things too profound or too strange to reconcile easily. And yet, their desire for understanding, the need to know what had happened during those missing hours, was stronger than hesitation. The sessions were painstaking. Each Hill was guided separately to prevent influence or contamination of memory. The room was quiet, dimly lit. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint ticking of a clock, the only sounds. Dr. Simon's voice was steady, gentle, encouraging. He asked them to breathe, to visualize, to follow the unfolding images in their minds. And as the hypnotic state deepened, fragments of memory began to surface. Sensations, impressions that neither Hill could have fabricated with such detail and consistency. Barney spoke first of the roadblock, a moment of sudden pause in the night, a sense of authority and observation that did not rely on words. He described stepping out of the car, binoculars in hand, the forest silent, the trees looming, and then the figures. He struggled to articulate what it felt like to meet the gaze of a presence that was neither human nor malevolent, yet undeniably aware. The eyes, he whispered in one session, they weren't just looking. They were pressing into me, into my mind. The words trembled on his lips, raw with the intensity of memory. Betty's recollections carried the sensation of being guided, touched by procedures that were precise yet alien. She described a leader, a figure whose presence was quiet but commanding, accompanied by subtle communication in a language that was not spoken in any ordinary sense. She remembered being shown instruments, having samples taken, being observed with care and intention. And then, at the center of a memory, a star map, a celestial diagram of points and connections, which she later recreated in painstaking detail. The alignment between their memories was striking. Though hypnotized separately, the details matched. The roadblock, the hovering craft, the humanoid figures, the instruments. The star map appeared in both narratives with eerie similarity. Researchers would later marvel at the consistency, questioning how two people, under separate conditions, could independently generate such converging accounts. It was a convergence that spoke of something beyond ordinary recall, a shared memory that seemed to defy the usual bounds of experience. Yet the process was not without strain. Each session left the Hills drained, as if the act of remembering required a toll on both body and mind. Barney often needed quiet afterward, his thoughts tangled in sensations that resisted articulation. Betty experienced moments of confusion, the merging of dream and reality so vivid that she sometimes questioned whether waking life was any more real than what she had accessed under hypnosis. Dr. Simon guided them patiently, balancing the need for exploration with the imperative of psychological safety. Over time, the fragments coalesced into a broader understanding. The Hills began to perceive the events not merely as a sequence of external encounters, but as an intricate interaction between perception, mind, and environment. The road through the White Mountains became more than a passage. It was a stage where consciousness, memory, and extraordinary events intersected. The craft and its occupants, once distant and enigmatic, were now understood as participants in a narrative that spanned both waking and subconscious realms. Outside the hypnotic sessions, life carried on with a quiet tension. The anomalista stopped watches, the altered compasses, the marks on clothing and car remained. Anchoring the extraordinary in the material world, the dreams, vivid and insistent, wove through nights, reminding the Hills of the continuity between what was remembered and what was experienced. Friends and family noticed subtle changes, heightened attention to detail, moments of sudden reflection, the occasional distant stare. Yet Betty and Barney carried these experiences without public display, their outward lives maintaining the steady rhythm of work, community, and family. The hypnotic exploration revealed more than just events. It revealed how human consciousness responds to the inexplicable. Fear, curiosity, wonder, and logic intertwined, shaping memory in ways that were unique, personal, and profound. Each recalled moment was a brushstroke on a larger canvas, a portrait of an encounter that could not be fully captured by photographs, recordings, or reports. Memory itself became both the vessel and the lens through which the Hills experienced the extraordinary. In the broader context, these sessions would come to define the framework for future abduction reports. The concept of missing time, the detailed recollection and the vivid, replicable imagery would form the template for countless accounts in the decades to follow. Yet for Betty and Barney, it remained intensely personal, a journey into the mind's hidden corridors, a confrontation with events that defied easy explanation, a reminder that reality has layers unseen by casual observation. And so, memory became the thread connecting past, present, and speculation. The Hills learned that what is hidden beneath consciousness is not less real because it is unobservable. Sometimes, the most profound truths are carried silently, waiting for careful attention, patient exploration, and a willingness to engage with the unknown. Their journey through memory illuminated the subtle dance between mind and experience, between the tangible and the extraordinary, creating a quiet legacy that would inform belief, skepticism, and wonder for generations. As the years passed, Betty and Barney shared their insights cautiously. Publicly, the story was fascinating, controversial, and widely discussed. Privately, it was the quiet contemplation of memory, the exploration of dreams, and the patient unpacking of the unseen. Each remembered moment, each image recalled, was a beacon pointing toward understanding and acknowledgement that the extraordinary does not always announce itself with fanfare, but often whispers through the corridors of the mind, waiting for those willing to listen. Some memories remain silent, yet they echo in every pause, every quiet night, and every reflective mind. Chapter 13. Shadows in the Sky. The night sky has a way of making the ordinary feel vast, of turning the familiar into something quietly extraordinary. When Betty and Barney Hill looked upward on that September evening, they were seeking only the soft comfort of stars and the steady hum of routine travel. They were not searching for revelations, and certainly not for a confrontation with the impossible. Yet, sometimes, the universe chooses its moments with deliberate subtlety, nudging ordinary lives toward extraordinary experiences. The white mountains of New Hampshire stretched endlessly around them, dark and unyielding, trees pressed close to the narrow ribbon of U.S. Route 3, their forms distorted by the occasional passing headlights. Shadows stretched and merged, forming shapes that the mind could interpret in countless ways. But the Hills had never seen anything like what emerged that night. A small point of light glimmered at first, almost innocuous, drifting among the stars like a distant satellite. Betty noticed it first, her gaze catching the flicker that did not belong. It pulsed with a strange rhythm, gentle but deliberate, and then, imperceptibly, it began to move in ways that defied the natural order. Barney tried to rationalize it. A plane, he told himself. A meteor, even a satellite, though its movement felt uncanny. He spoke aloud to steady the rising tension, offering explanations that both comforted and failed him simultaneously. The night seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, inviting them to observe more closely. And then, without warning, the light changed, brightening, altering its trajectory, darting across the sky with an intelligence that startled them into silence. The Hills stopped the car, one tentative pause after another, each interval filled with an odd mixture of curiosity and caution. Every time the light shifted or drew closer, their hearts quickened. Barney grabbed the binoculars, and as he brought the distant glow into focus, the outline of a craft became clear, a saucer-like shape, smooth and metallic, with lights that swirled along its perimeter in soft, mesmerizing patterns. The motion was too deliberate to be a coincidence, too precise to be natural. Betty, her hands trembling, took the binoculars next, feeling the strange weight of focus settle over her mind. Her breath caught as she realized the object was no ordinary aircraft, no distant anomaly. It was near, too near. When the craft descended closer, hovering just above the treetops, near Indian Head, the scene grew surreal. From its windows, humanoid forms appeared, 8 to 11 in number, small but distinct. Their movements, deliberate yet unreadable. One figure seemed to meet Barney's gaze directly. It was an encounter devoid of words, yet filled with communication of the most subtle kind of silent recognition that left Barney aware of a presence that extended beyond the physical. And then it came not a voice, but a thought, a command that seemed to press into his mind. Stay where you are. The words, or perhaps the sensation of them, locked him into a moment suspended between reality and something otherworldly. Fear gripped him, sudden and unrelenting, as though the air itself had thickened. His body reacted before his mind could fully process. He stumbled, nearly dropping the binoculars, and ran back to the car, a sense of urgency coursing through him like electricity. "They're going to capture us," he shouted, the words jagged in the cold night air. A rhythmic beeping began, faint at first, then enveloping. It was mechanical, hypnotic, almost soothing in its persistence, yet charged with a subtle tension that both unnerved and captivated. The sound washed over them, a tide against which their awareness began to drift. Moments, or what felt like moments, slipped into a fog, a liminal space between consciousness and dream. Then darkness, absolute and quiet. The world seemed to dissolve into something that was not night, not blackness, but a kind of suspended nothingness. When they regained awareness, the landscape had shifted. They were 35 miles south, near Ashland, with no memory of the intervening journey. Time itself had fractured, leaving only a gap that neither could fill. Watches had stopped. The car bore subtle markscuffs on shoes, strange powders on clothing, and magnetic anomalies on the trunk. And their minds were left to reconcile the dissonance between the night's vivid, surreal impressions and the ordinary world into which they returned. The next days brought subtle tremors of memory. Betty's dreams intensified, each night revealing more detailed sequences. Gray figures escorting them into cold, metallic interiors. Procedures conducted with clinical detachment. The enigmatic star map illuminated in soft light. Dreams that felt more like memories than imagination, leaving impressions of textures, sounds, and sensations that lingered after waking. Barney experienced similar disturbances. Flashes of visual information, the pressure of unseen attention, an acute awareness of intelligence watching and measuring. The dreams were not frightening in the conventional sense. They were strange, compelling, and insistently real. This emerging pattern of subconscious recollection prompted them to seek help. Dr. Benjamin Simon guided the process with careful precision, using hypnosis to peel back the layers of memory without forcing interpretation. Each session revealed fragments, meticulously documented, cross-referenced, and analyzed. The roadblock appeared consistently in both accounts, a checkpoint of some kind, subtle but undeniable. The craft's interior revealed instruments, panels, and figures performing tasks with deliberate precision. Betty recalled attempts to communicate, a quiet exchange mediated through symbols and murmured syllables that defied conventional understanding. The star map, meticulously recreated, suggested an astronomical coherence that sparked both fascination and skepticism in later study. What fascinated the Hills and researchers was the consistency. Although hypnotized separately, the images they recalled were not only vivid but matched in details impossible to coordinate through casual communication. The interplay of the familiar and the alien, the tangible and the ethereal, created a narrative that occupied a space between documented events and deeply personal experience. Each session left an impression of wonder intertwined with the unavoidable reality of human limitation. There were boundaries to what could be known, edges where comprehension faltered, and zones where the extraordinary quietly asserted itself without needing to be declared. The geographical context contributed its own influence. Franconia notched the dense forests. The narrow roads winding through the mountains, each element shaped the encounter. The isolation amplified awareness, while the familiar road provided a grounding that contrasted with the surreal events unfolding above. Time, too, seemed elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that conventional measures could not capture. The Hills' perception of distance, duration, and movement became as fluid as the lights in the sky. bending ordinary understanding into a liminal experience that both terrified and mesmerized. Cultural and personal factors intertwined with the encounter. Betty and Barney were not passive witnesses. Their life experiences, roles in civil rights activism, and grounding in practical realities colored their interpretation. The event's ambiguity demanded that they navigate both public scrutiny and private understanding, balancing the need for rational explanation against the undeniable persistence of phenomena beyond expectation. Their responses, measured and conscientious, shaped the narrative that would later guide ufologists, investigators, and cultural storytellers for decades. Memory, observation, and environment coalesced into a living tableau, a story of shadows and light, of the familiar transformed by subtle, persistent anomalies. Every heartbeat, every pulse of light, every shift in perception carried meaning, whether understood or not. The Hills' experience reminded the world that extraordinary events do not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes they emerge quietly, in the folds of ordinary nights, in moments when curiosity, attention, and presence converge. And so, the shadows in the sky were not merely objects. They were catalysts, reflections of human awareness, engaging with the unknown. For the Hills, the events were both external and internal, a delicate interplay between perception, memory, and consciousness. They became custodians of experience, documenting fragments of a night that would ripple through history, psychology, and popular imagination. Decades later, researchers, writers, and ordinary dreamers still retrace the White Mountains, imagining what it would be like to encounter the inexplicable on a quiet September night. The story of Betty and Barney Hill serves as a reminder. The universe has its own rhythm, and sometimes it pauses just long enough for ordinary lives to brush against the extraordinary. Time might pass, but some nights, some lights in the sky never fade completely. They linger, suspended in memory, whispering quietly to those who care to look and to listen. The stars above the White Mountains still shine, and somewhere in their quiet glow, a question waits patiently. Chapter 14. The Star Map and the Silent Language. After the lights had vanished into the night sky, after the interval of confusion and missing time, a new layer of mystery began to take shape in Betty's mind. It was subtle at first, like a memory stirring just beneath the surface, and then it became insistent, a vision that would not be ignored. A star map. Tiny dots arranged in patterns, connected with lines only her memory could draw. She did not sketch immediately. She did not speak. She simply carried it with her, folded quietly into the corners of thought, as if waiting for the right moment to emerge. Barney noticed her change. There was a light in her eyes that day that had not been there before, an intensity that was calm but unyielding. She would hum softly when she thought she was alone, tracing invisible constellations with her fingers in the sunlight, or tilting her head to follow the alignment of stars that seemed familiar yet impossible to name. It was a language without words, a communication between mind and cosmos that she had never learned but somehow understood. One evening, long after the drive home, the sensation became tangible. She sat at the small kitchen table, penciling and paper spread before her, and began to draw. Dots, lines, geometric patterns, delicate, precise, as though some unseen force guided her hand. Barney watched quietly from the other side of the room, a mixture of skepticism and fascination tightening around his chest. He did not interrupt, and she did not explain. It was as if the map itself demanded respect, its details sacred and unspoken. The patterns, when complete, revealed a star system that seemed distant, yet oddly familiar. Lines connected points across vast imaginary distances, forming an intricate lattice of light. Even at first glance, the map had a gravity, a quiet insistence that it contained meaning far beyond casual observation. When Betty spoke of it later, her words were careful, precise, tinged with reverence. "It's not just stars," she said softly. "It's directions. It's a place, or maybe a pathway." This map would later capture the attention of others, not merely for its artistry, but for its uncanny alignment with known celestial coordinates. Marjorie Fish, an amateur astronomer, took the drawings and began the painstaking work of matching them to real stars. She rotated the conceptual arrangement in her mind, aligning perspectives, adjusting distances, Slowly, almost impossibly, she proposed a match set theoretically a double-star system far across the cosmos, remote and precise. The suggestion was met with both awe and skepticism. Carl Sagan, ever the rationalist, argued that the alignment could be coincidental. Yet the map's significance persisted, not just in the coordinates, but in the intention it represented. The Hill's undeniable attempt to translate something beyond words into human comprehension. The star map was more than cartography. It was part of a silent language, a mode of communication that did not require speech, but existed entirely in perception and cognition. Betty recalled attempts by the beings to engage her mind, their attention subtle, deliberate. Sound soft, murmuring code in a rhythm that was neither threatening nor overtly friendly. Barney, too, remembered feelings of awareness, an almost magnetic pull, as if the craft itself emitted a consciousness that reached outward, brushing gently against his thoughts. For both, the memory was immersive. The sensations were layered. A faint hum that resonated through bones, a temperature shift that made the skin feel attuned to invisible forces, a fleeting awareness of observation, and observation returned. The craft's interior was clinical, yet intimate. Instruments lined metallic panels, but their purpose was ambiguous. Needles, samples, tests, they were conducted with neither cruelty nor kindness, only intention. The beings did not speak as humans do. Instead, they seemed to project understanding, a quiet insistence that was absorbed rather than articulated. Over time, these experiences seeped into daily life. Betty would awaken in the early hours, the patterns of the stars etched into her mind, blinking at the ceiling as if tracing them among the shadows. Barney, practical and disciplined, found himself recounting sequences, movements, sensations that did not belong to ordinary memory. Conversations at the kitchen table became punctuated with silences filled with thought, reflection, and the unspoken need to process something that could not be explained fully. The hypnotic sessions, conducted under Dr. Benjamin Simon, gave structure to the intangible. Each detail, when recalled, was painstakingly documented. The position of lights, the size and shape of figures, the sequence of actions within the craft. What emerged was consistency across two minds, two bodies, and two sets of perceptions, joined by memory yet separate in the way it formed. The star map, the silent language, the rhythmic humming all became pieces of a puzzle that was larger than any individual part. It was not merely the specifics of the experience that drew attention. It was the humanity intertwined with the extraordinary. Betty and Barney were never just witnesses. They were participants in a sequence that required observation, interpretation, and response. Their reactions calm determination, careful attention. Occasional fear imbued the events with a sense of realism. This was not a dramatized narrative, not a story built for attention. It was an encounter lived, carried in quiet forms, subtle gestures, and the steady accumulation of extraordinary detail. The Hill's experience also raised questions about communication and perception. If the beings had intended to convey information, what form should that take? How does one translate a sensation into language, or a pattern of stars into meaning comprehensible to another species? The star map, in this sense, was a bridge, a representation of intent, filtered through human understanding. Yet it remained incomplete, a key without a lock, a song whose notes could be traced but never fully heard. Researchers who later examined the map and the hypnotic transcripts noted another subtle element: the emotional resonance of the recollections. Fear was present, yes, but it was layered with curiosity, focus, and attentiveness. The Hill's minds absorbed the environment, processed it, and returned with a narrative that blended the surreal with the profoundly human. Each detail, each line drawn or described, carried weight precisely because it was grounded in lived experience, not imagination alone. The map also influenced cultural consciousness. Its depiction of Zeta Reticuli, later popularized through media and discussion, introduced a specific frame for understanding extraterrestrial origin points. For countless enthusiasts, it provided both direction and context, a celestial anchor for speculation and reflection. Yet, it was always a map of perception as much as of space. The Hills did not point to a star system as a simple destination. They revealed a pattern, a perspective, a subtle invitation to contemplate the broader universe. For Betty and Barney, the aftermath of that night was a continued navigation between reality and interpretation. They lived ordinary lives, yet carried extraordinary knowledge, fragments of events that few could verify and fewer still could comprehend. The star map was both a gift and a burden, a silent reminder that some experiences are ineffable, that not all knowledge arrives with clarity, and that sometimes the act of remembering is as vital as the memory itself. And so, nights passed with quiet reflection. The sky, calm and distant, seemed to pulse with invisible rhythm. The hills, in separate rooms or quiet corners, traced patterns, considered sequences, and revisited memories that refused to fade. The universe, in its vastness, remained indifferent yet compelling, offering glimpses of structure and meaning to those who cared to look closely. The star map, in particular, stood as a symbol of attention, of observation, of the possibility that some mysteries are meant to be engaged with rather than solved. This chapter in their story was not about spectacle. It was about subtlety, the quiet language of experience, the bridge between perception and reality, the whispered understanding that there are phenomena beyond the immediate reach of conventional knowledge. The map and the silent language became tools of reflection, guiding not just the hills, but future generations of enthusiasts and dreamers toward considering the unknown with patience, thoughtfulness, and an openness that did not demand fear or certainty. And in that gentle unfolding, there was wonder. Not the loud, exaggerated kind, but a serene, hypnotic curiosity that lingered like starlight on the edge of awareness. It was a reminder that the universe communicates in many forms, sometimes through whispers, sometimes through patterns etched into memory, and sometimes through the quiet insistence of a point of light moving across a dark, familiar sky. The map on her table, the lines traced in pencil, glimmered in the lamp's soft glow, waiting for anyone willing to follow the silent language of the stars. Chapter 15. Night had settled softly over the White Mountains, painting the trees and ridges in a deep indigo that seemed almost tangible. The air was cooler now, carrying a faint scent of pine and damp earth. And the quiet was profound, so quiet that even the slightest rustle of leaves sounded like a whisper in the dark. For Betty and Barney, even decades later, nights like this could awaken memories of that long ago September evening when something inexplicable had shifted the course of their lives. The hillsides around Franconia and Notch had changed very little over the years. The roads remained narrow, twisting through the silent forest like a ribbon of shadow. The memory of the glowing object, its erratic movements, the sudden drops in rhythm, the way it seemed to watch them still lingered in Barney's mind as if it had been etched there by light itself. He often found himself staring at the night sky, imagining the flicker of that strange glow, wondering whether any of it had been real, or if the mind simply constructs stories to fill in the blanks where memory falters. For Betty, the nights brought other impressions, shapes, colors, fragments of the dreams she could never fully shake. Even when the years had softened the terror, they had not erased the vividness of the flashes, the metallic smell, the clinical coldness of the room she had described under hypnosis. She remembered too the way Barney had trembled when he first described the beings, how their shared fear had bonded them even more tightly, reinforcing the quiet, steady strength that had carried them through every difficulty life had thrown their way. On this particular evening, the hills were recalling their story not in a state of panic, but as part of a gentle reflection. They had become accustomed, in a way, to the strange rhythms of their own recollections. The way moments of clarity could appear suddenly, and the way whole hours could vanish from conscious memory as if they had never existed. They spoke in low tones, as if afraid to disturb the lingering night. "You know," Barney said, "sometimes I still feel like I can hear that beeping, just faintly, like it's coming from the hills themselves." Betty nodded slowly. "Or from somewhere inside us," she replied. "It's funny how the mind keeps playing those sounds, like a recording we never pressed stop on." She smiled faintly, but there was no mockery in it, only wonder and a hint of sorrow, the kind that comes from living with something inexplicable for decades. It was then that the conversation drifted toward the details they had only ever shared in fragments, moments during hypnosis, or in hushed conversations with investigators. They began speaking of the stars, the ones Betty had drawn on that star map, the ones Marjorie Fish had later linked to Zeta Reticuli. Even now, when she traced the lines of the map in her mind, she felt a subtle thrill, the same sense of curiosity that had first stirred in her when she had glimpsed this strange craft hovering above the darkened highway. Barney leaned back in his chair and let the memory wash over him like a slow current. "I think about the figures sometimes," he said quietly. "Not just the shapes, but the way they stood there. So calm, so unafraid. It was like they understood something about us that we didn't understand about ourselves." Betty closed her eyes, imagining that night once more. The headlights of the car, the rhythm of the engine, the shiver of fear running along her spine. She remembered the sudden command that had entered her mind, a voice without a sound. "Stay where you are." And yet, even in that moment, there had been a strange clarity, a sense that everything happening was part of something larger, beyond the comprehension of ordinary life. The Hills often reflected on what it meant to experience something so profound and elusive. They had never sought fame or notoriety, but their story had taken on a life of its own, spreading through newspapers, books, documentaries, and films. Each telling brought new interpretations, some skeptical, some barren, and yet none could fully capture the private intensity of the encounter. "And the timing of it all," Barney murmured. "The way it interrupted our ordinary lives. Do you ever wonder if it had a purpose?" Betty opened her eyes and considered him for a long moment. "Maybe," she said softly. "Or maybe there's no purpose at all. Maybe some things just happen, and all we can do is remember, try to understand, and keep moving forward." That evening, as they spoke, the sky slowly deepened into a velvet black. A few stars had begun to pierce the darkness, distant and cold, yet somehow familiar. The Hills often felt a peculiar comfort in misty universe. In its vastness, held echoes of the moment that had changed them. It reminded them that they were part of something immense, a thread woven into a pattern they could barely perceive. Barney's mind wandered to the people who had studied their story over the years. Researchers, skeptics, believers. Journalists all had tried to piece together the events of that September night. Some had focused on physical traces, some on hypnosis sessions, others on cultural or psychological interpretations. Yet no single explanation had fully captured the experience. Even now, he could appreciate the subtle truth of that ambiguity. That reality sometimes resists being neatly categorized. Betty too recognized the ongoing dialogue between memory and imagination. The dreams that had begun in the days after their encounter never entirely ceased. Occasionally, she would see the gray figures again, in the quiet of sleep, moving through the sterile, metallic corridors, she remembered. But these visions no longer terrified her. Instead, they prompted thought, reflection, and a gentle curiosity, a willingness to explore the limits of what is known and what is possible. They spoke of time, to the strange elasticity of it during the encounter. Hours had vanished, replaced by a sense of dislocation and uncertainty. Even now she could feel that same sensation if she dwelt on it long enough. The awareness that the world could slip past in a moment, that the universe might stretch and fold in ways they could never fully grasp. And the people, Barney added, all those who believed us, doubted us, or just listened, I think we became part of something bigger than ourselves. Something that goes on beyond us. Betty nodded, her fingers tracing an absent line in the air. Yes. The story isn't just ours anymore. It belongs to anyone who has ever looked up at the sky and wondered what is out there. It belongs to curiosity itself. For the Hills, the narrative of that September night had become intertwined with their lives, not as a tale of fear, but as an enduring meditation on wonder and possibility. They had learned to live alongside the uncertainty, to allow it space without needing to resolve every detail. And in that acceptance, there was a quiet strength, a sense that life strange, mysterious, sometimes frightening, was still a place where ordinary people could encounter the extraordinary. Outside, the night continued to breathe around them. The forest remained still, the mountains silent, the stars distant and patient. It was easy to forget that the world below was bustling with noise, duty, and expectation. Up here, in the quiet, the universe could simply exist. As they spoke, the Hills realized that the events of that night had shaped them in subtle ways, informing their perception of reality, their empathy for others, and their willingness to accept mystery. It was not a story they could fully explain, nor did they need to. The truth of it lay in the experience itself, in the interplay of fear, a wee and quiet discovery that had forever altered the contours of their ordinary lives. When the first hints of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, the Hills rose from their chairs and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of a new day. Somewhere in the distance, the mountains caught the faint glow of early sunlight, highlighting ridges and valleys that had remained largely unchanged since that September. For a moment, time seemed to fold in upon itself. Memory, present, and possibility all existed in the same gentle stretch of light. They stood together, silent, sharing a space that had become sacred through experience. No words were necessary. The night, the stars, the forest, and the mountains had witnessed their journey. Their hearts carried it forward, and in that quiet understanding, there was a profound, peace sense that life, with all its mysteries, could be lived with openness, curiosity, and quiet courage. For Betty and Barney Hill, that night, and all the nights that followed, were not simply about an encounter with the unknown. They were about living with wonder, observing the subtle layers of reality, and embracing the threads of mystery that weave through every human life. They had become keepers of a story that refused to fade, guardians of the quiet questions that linger long after the lights have gone. And as the morning light fully embraced the mountains, the Hills walked back inside, carrying with them the calm knowledge that some things are meant to be experienced, remembered, and shared, not fully solved, but fully felt. The mountains waited patiently, keeping their secrets in the folds of shadow and sky. Chapter 16. The early morning mist hung low over the valleys, curling around the pines and settling in the hollows like a delicate, pale blanket. For those who passed through the White Mountains, it was the kind of morning that seemed almost suspended in time, where each breath felt heavier with stillness and the edges of reality soft, just enough to make the mind wander. Betty and Barney often remembered such mornings with a peculiar fondness, though the memories were always tinged with the unshakable shadow of that night so many years ago. It had been decades since the encounter, yet the details remained vivid, etched into their minds with a clarity that resisted fading. For Barney, the memory often returned in quiet moments while sorting mail, walking along familiar streets, or gazing at the sky from their backyard. He could recall the subtle shifts in light, the almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate beneath the surface of the world. Even now, it was as if the universe had left a tiny signature, a soft tremor only he could feel. Betty, meanwhile, carried the memory differently. She remembered textures, scents, and sensations with a precision that sometimes startled her. The cold metallic surface of the craft, the smoothness of the instruments, the faint, almost sweet aroma of the pink powder that had stained her dress. Each detail lingered like a note in a quiet song that never truly ended. In her dreams, she sometimes wandered the corridors of that otherworldly place, the gray figures watching silently, the lights pulsing with a rhythm she could almost feel in her chest. On this particular morning, they found themselves reflecting on the broader currents that had rippled outward from their experience. Over the decades, their story had taken on a life of its own. It had influenced pop culture, inspired books and films, and stirred debates among scientists, psychologists, and ordinary people who dared to imagine that the universe held more than the eye could see. They had never sought this attention, yet the world seemed unable to resist the magnetism of their tale that combined fear, wonder, and the persistent pull of the unknown. The Hills had often wondered why their experience resonated so deeply with others. Perhaps it was the universality of the themes, the delicate tension between belief and skepticism, the strange thrill of encountering something beyond comprehension, the fragile interplay of fear and curiosity. Or perhaps it was the way the story unfolded, step by step, inviting people to imagine themselves in those quiet, dark moments on a lonely highway. Barney poured himself a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping through his hands as he leaned against the kitchen counter. "I still think about how ordinary we were," he said, eyes fixed on the pale light filtering through the curtains. "We weren't looking for anything, and yet it found us. Or maybe we found it." Betty stirred her tea, her thoughts drifting to the hypnotic sessions with Dr. Simon, the way memories had surfaced slowly, like fish beneath a rippling surface. "Maybe that's the part that matters most," she mused softly. "Not just what we saw, but how it changed us. How we think, how we wonder, how we accept that not everything can be explained." Their conversation meandered, gentle and unhurried, weaving through decades of reflection. They spoke of the scientific inquiries, the skeptics, and the believers, and of the delicate balance between certainty and doubt. They acknowledged the imperfections in memory, the possibilities of suggestion, and the influence of culture. Yet, through it all, there remained a core of undeniable experience, moments of pure, unfiltered perception that could not be dismissed entirely, no matter the explanations offered. Barney's gaze drifted to the window, where the morning light highlighted the silhouette of the mountains. "I think about the other nights," he said quietly. "Those moments when everything seemed to stretch and bend. Time, perception, even our sense of who we were. How does one even begin to describe that?" Betty smiled faintly, a mixture of warmth and melancholy in her expression. "You don't, really?" she said. "You live it, you remember it, you carry it with you. And maybe, in sharing it, you allow others to glimpse a piece of it, too, just enough to spark their own curiosity." The day unfolded slowly, each hour passing with the unhurried rhythm of lives long accustomed to reflection. They revisited old photographs, letters, and documents, tracing the path of their journey through memory and history. Each artifact was a touchstone, a reminder that the story was both personal and public, intimate yet shared across generations. Barney remembered the moments immediately following the encounter, the fear, the disorientation, the questions that seemed too large to hold, how time had fractured, leaving them unsure of what had passed and what had been taken from them. How every night afterward carried echoes of that experience, in dreams, in fleeting sensations, in the quiet pull of imagination. Betty recalled the dreams vividly, the gray figures, the metallic rooms, the instruments, and the soft murmurs of a language she could not fully understand. But she also remembered the resilience, the way they had supported each other, grounding themselves in love, shared values, and the determination to navigate a world that often seemed indifferent or even hostile. Together, they reflected on the societal impact of their story, the cultural fascination, the debates, and the questions raised about the nature of memory, perception, and truth. They understood that their experience had become a lens through which people could explore their own fears, hopes, and curiosities. They had unwittingly provided a framework for understanding encounters with the unknown, a touchstone for both scientific inquiry and personal contemplation. The Hills also considered the ways their personal identities had intersected with the narrative. As an interracial couple in the early 1960s, they were already navigating a world fraught with judgment and prejudice. Their experience had been filtered through these lenses, shaping both public perception and their own understanding of the events. The intertwining of personal, cultural, and cosmic threads made the story richer, more complex, and ultimately more human. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting soft shadows across the kitchen floor, they spoke of the endurance of memory and the subtle persistence of mystery. Some nights, the old fear returned briefly, like a shadow at the edge of vision, but it no longer controlled them. Instead, it became part of a larger rhythm, a pattern of reflection, curiosity, and gentle awe. Barney and Betty often returned to the stars in conversation, imagining the light years between them and the distant points that might have been the origin of the beings they had glimpsed. They wondered about the nature of life in the universe, the possibilities of intelligence beyond Earth, and the delicate threads that connect perception, reality, and imagination. There was a quiet satisfaction in the unknown, a recognition that not all questions demand answers, and that some experiences are valuable precisely because they remain partly unexplained. The Hills had come to appreciate the balance between inquiry and acceptance, understanding that mystery, when approached with calm reflection, could inspire growth, empathy, and wonder. As the day waned and the sun began to dip behind the western ridges, the Hills stepped outside once more. The mountains, bathed in the golden glow of evening, seemed to pulse with the memory of countless stories, silent witnesses to moments both ordinary and extraordinary. The air carried the familiar sense of pine and earth, and the subtle rustle of leaves suggested movement in spaces unseen. Standing together, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet gratitude for each other, for the endurance of memory, and for the lessons that came from living alongside something unexplainable. They had learned patience, reflection, and the art of navigating wonder without fear. And in that quiet, the mountains seemed to respond, echoing the presence of a story that had endured, carried forward by the lives it touched and the minds it continued to ignite. The hills had become guardians of a narrative that refused to be fully tamed, witnesses to the extraordinary within the ordinary, and teachers of the subtle art of embracing questions without needing immediate answers. As darkness crept in and the first stars blinked awake, Barney and Betty Hill retreated indoors, carrying with them the gentle awareness that the universe, in all its vastness, was patient and enduring, much like the mountains themselves. They had walked the path of wonder and memory, and they had emerged with a serene understanding that some encounters do not end, they ripple forward in stories, reflection, and the quiet spaces between one moment and the next. The stars lingered overhead, a silent audience, to a story that stretched beyond time, still unfolding in the hearts of those who remembered. Chapter 17. The evening sky settled into a deep, velvety blue, and the mountains seemed to exhale, releasing the warmth of the day into the cooling air. Shadows lengthened across the valleys, slipping into the hollows and gathering around the bases of the pines, creating a quiet symphony of dark and light. For decades, this land had remained unchanged in many ways, untouched and patient, as if waiting for the memory of that night to ripple once more across its silent slopes. Barney and Betty often reflected on the subtle ways their lives had changed since the encounter, even long after the immediate shock had faded. It wasn't indeed just the curiosity of strangers or the occasional journalist at the door. It was the quiet, almost imperceptible shift in how they noticed the world. Barney would sometimes pause in the middle of a task, sensing a movement in the air, a hum beneath the branches, and a light that seemed to hesitate just beyond the horizon. Betty would tilt her head when a faint glow appeared in the night sky, or when a pattern of stars seemed familiar, evoking a half-remembered memory of something larger, something waiting beyond understanding. Their lives had settled into routines, yes, but the memory of the encounter had layered itself beneath every ordinary act. Morning coffee carried a reverence for the simple warmth in their hands. Walking the dog through the neighborhood streets, they sometimes felt the subtle tug of perspective, the idea that even a quiet, familiar world could hold unspoken mysteries. They had learned that the extraordinary could hide in plain sight, disguised as routine, waiting for careful attention to reveal it. In the evenings, they often sat by the window, watching the first stars emerge. Barney would speak in measured tones, sometimes narrating the small, precise details that had persisted in his memory. The way the lights had moved, the shapes that had hovered, the rhythm of the beeping that seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. Betty, listening quietly, would occasionally interject, recalling textures and sounds, the faint smell of metal, or the soft sensation of being guided through spaces both alien and yet strangely structured. They both understood that their experience had shifted something fundamental in their perception of the universe. It was not merely about fear or fascination, it was about a delicate awareness of possibility. That awareness had crept into the folds of their everyday lives. The manner in which they watched the sky, the patient listening to the wind, the measured attention to patterns and irregularities that others might dismiss. It was a mindfulness, born of wonder and tempered by experience. Barney had become more contemplative over time. In quiet moments, he would consider the intricate relationship between memory and reality. He knew the skeptics would argue that their perceptions were flawed, that their memories were shaped by anxiety, suggestion, or cultural influence. Yet he also knew the undeniable consistency of the details. He and Betty recalled the way their stories aligned, sometimes perfectly, even after years of silence and reflection. It was a harmony that neither coincidence nor imagination could solely explain. Betty, with her social work background, saw the encounter through another lens. She considered the ways trauma and memory intertwined, how events could embed themselves deep within consciousness and manifest in dreams, sensations, or even subtle emotional responses long after the fact. But she also knew that some aspects of their experience defied ordinary explanation, and that mystery itself could coexist with reason, forming a bridge between wonder and understanding. As the evening deepened into night, they often revisited the paths they had taken, tracing the route along US Route 3 in their minds. They imagined the dark highway, the dense forests, and the narrow valleys of the White Mountains. Each turn, each clearing, each stretch of shadow seemed imbued with layers of meaning they could not fully articulate. It was as though the landscape itself held a memory, a silent witness to the moments when the ordinary world had intersected with something entirely other. Over time, the public fascination with their story had grown and shifted. Books, documentaries, and articles had explored every angle imaginable, from physical evidence to psychological analysis, from cultural impact to extraterrestrial possibility. And yet, for the Hills, the story remained fundamentally personal. It was not the headlines or the debates that defined it. It was the quiet, persistent resonance of what had been experienced, and the ripple it created in their own understanding of life and the universe. They sometimes discussed the ways their story had inspired others, consciously or unconsciously. People who had never traveled to the mountains, who had never seen the lights themselves, found resonance in the narrative. The universal themes: curiosity, fear, wonder, and the search for meaning allowed their experience to extend far beyond the confines of geography or circumstance. Through the retelling, the memory became a vessel, carrying subtle lessons about perception, humility, and the patience required to navigate mysteries that refused to resolve neatly. Barney often reflected on the intersection between their personal lives and the broader cultural currents. Being an interracial couple in the early 1960s, they had navigated prejudice and societal scrutiny, and those experiences had inevitably shaped the reception of their story. They understood that the blend of social context, personal courage, and sheer coincidence had created a unique narrative, one that resonated both for its extraordinary content and for the ordinary humanity of the witnesses. Betty, meanwhile, found solace in the continued search for understanding. She followed scientific developments, contemporary UFO studies, and even revisitations of their own case by researchers and enthusiasts. She appreciated the careful analyses, the respectful questioning, and the way the story continued to encourage exploration of the unknown. At the same time, she maintained a grounded perspective, understanding that some mysteries were meant to coexist with uncertainty, allowing imagination, reflection, and curiosity to flourish. One particularly calm night, as the stars shimmered above the peaks, Barney recounted a memory that had surfaced only recently. "Do you remember how the lights seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for something?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Betty nodded, eyes fixed on a constellation that seemed uncannily similar to the one she had drawn from memory all those years ago. The sense of waiting, of intention beyond comprehension, remained one of the most haunting and fascinating aspects of the encounter. They spoke of the subtle ways in which this memory had influenced their outlook on life. The experience had imbued them with patience, a measured curiosity, and a gentle acceptance that not everything in existence could be catalogued or fully explained. It had shaped the way they engaged with the world, the way they nurtured relationships, and the way they navigated moments of ambiguity. Even in their silence, the memory resonated. The Hills had learned to honor it without letting it dominate, to acknowledge its presence without being controlled by it. There was a delicate rhythm in their understanding, a balance between vigilance and ease, between observation and reflection, between questioning and acceptance. As the night deepened and the mountains settled into a hushed stillness, the Hills often found themselves contemplating the larger questions their encounter had raised. They considered the nature of consciousness, the potential for intelligence beyond Earth, and the ways human perception could stretch to accommodate the extraordinary. They reflected on time itself, on the peculiar elasticity that had allowed moments to expand and contract during the encounter, and on the persistent, sometimes playful, ways the mind remembered, interpreted, and reconstructed experiences. In those reflective hours, the Hills came to understand that their story was not only about what had happened on that dark September night. It was about the continuum of curiosity and understanding, the dialogue between the known and the unknown, and the subtle power of memory to shape perspective and inspire reflection. They had become living bridges between the ordinary and the extraordinary, guides for others who might one day encounter phenomena that challenged explanation. And so, as the first whispers of dawn touched the mountaintops, they often stood together at the edge of the porch, drinking in the quiet majesty of the mountains, the steady rise of the sun, and the lingering possibility that the universe, in all its vastness, might still be full of gentle mysteries waiting patiently for attention. The night's shadows receded, but the memory remained a quiet, enduring pulse beneath the fabric of everyday life, soft yet insistent, subtle yet unshakable. The mountains remained, silent and eternal, cradling the memory of that night like a secret waiting to be understood. Chapter 18. The sky had deepened into a soft, inky purple, and the first evening stars began to twinkle faintly, as if nudging the hills toward reflection. Nights in the White Mountains carried a weight all their own, a gentle, patient hush that seemed to absorb all sound and thought, leaving only space to notice the subtle hum of the world. For Betty and Barney, the mountains had become a canvas upon which memory and imagination could meet, where the ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted in quiet tension. Even years after the encounter, the nights held a strange, magnetic quality. Barney often found himself pausing mid-step during evening walks, sensing a shift in the air, a faint glimmer of light, a rustle in the pines, a pattern in the stars that teased recognition. Each detail reminded him of that night when the world had folded in on itself and the unimaginable had brushed against ordinary life. Betty, walking beside him, sometimes caught his glance and understood without words. They shared an awareness that certain mysteries do not vanish. They linger, settling into the mind, the body, and even the landscape itself. Their conversations that evening meandered like the winding roads they once drove, through memories both vivid and fractured. Barney spoke of the moments under hypnosis, when fragments of time the small details that had seemed insignificant then but later took on uncanny importance. The curve of a window, the hum of the craft, the positioning of figures in the light, all of it replayed in his mind with the precision of a memory and the fluidity of a dream. Betty, leaning against the porch railing, reflected on the dreams that had haunted her nights after the encounter. Not nightmares in the traditional sense, but echoes of events that had been experienced yet denied by ordinary perception. The dreams had been persistent, methodical, offering glimpses of spaces beyond comprehension, corridors of cold metal and soft lights, silent observers and instruments of unknown purpose. In hindsight, she could see how the dreams had woven themselves into the fabric of her consciousness, shaping her understanding of memory, fear, and awe. The hills often spoke of the fine line between recollection and imagination. It was a line that had blurred repeatedly over the years, especially under the influence of public scrutiny and hypnotic recall. Yet the consistency of their memories, the resonance of their shared experiences, and the subtle unexplained phenomena in the world around them maintained a steady reminder that something had occurred, something that could not be fully catalogued, dismissed, or reduced to coincidence. As the evening progressed, they reflected on the broader impact of their story. The Hill encounter had become a cultural touchstone, inspiring discussions in academic circles, documentaries, books, and popular culture. The small gray beings with large black eyes, descriptions drawn from memory, amplified through hypnosis, had become iconic, shaping the public's imagination about the unknown. Every new UFO report, every recounting of missing time or unexplained lights, carried a faint echo of that September night, a whisper of the story that had quietly rewritten expectations about what might exist beyond the human experience. Yet the Hills understood that their story was also intensely personal. It was a narrative of fear, curiosity, resilience, and adaptation. They had learned to navigate a world that simultaneously dismissed and celebrated their experiences. Neighbors, friends, and distant strangers had offered opinions, judgments, and theories. Yet the couple had cultivated a quiet confidence in their own recollection, a patience for the slow unraveling of understanding that no headline, no investigation, and no public curiosity could accelerate. On that particular evening, they turned their attention to the small, ordinary details of their environment, recognizing in them the subtle echoes of the extraordinary, the way the wind played over the trees, the occasional flicker of light across the valley, the distant call of a night bird. All were reminders of the interconnectedness of perception and reality. Even in mundane moments, the Hills found threads that led back to the encounter, teaching them to notice, reflect, and wonder without urgency or panic. Barney remembered the sensation of being watched that night, the strange intensity in the eyes of the beings aboard the craft, and the quiet command that had entered his mind. It was a memory that had shaped his understanding of consciousness and intention, prompting reflections on the nature of attention, observation, and unseen forces. Betty, in turn, considered the psychological interplay of fear, suggestion, and trust that had influenced their responses, recognizing that the human mind could both amplify and obscure experiences of the unusual. The couple often contemplated the influence of context, way the world had shaped their encounter, and the way their story had, in turn, shaped the world. Being an interracial couple in the early 1960s added layers of social complexity to the narrative. Their credibility had been scrutinized not only for the extraordinary content of their account, but also for the social perceptions that accompanied their identities. The intersection of personal experience and societal bias created a nuanced understanding of truth, one that extended beyond objective fact into realms of interpretation, belief, and empathy. As the night deepened, they spoke of the enduring lessons embedded in their story. Curiosity, patience, and openness to the unknown had become guiding principles. They had learned that not all questions required immediate answers, that some mysteries were meant to be explored slowly, with care and respect for the limits of perception. The encounter had expanded their capacity for wonder, teaching them that the universe could hold complexities and possibilities far beyond the imagination, and that awareness of these possibilities enriched, rather than diminished, everyday life. Barney and Betty also reflected on the ripple effects of their experiences on those who encountered their story. People drawn to the tale often found resonance not in its proof or lack thereof, but in its invitation to consider the unknown, to question assumptions, and to embrace the tension between belief and skepticism. The Hills had become quiet mentors, in a sense, living examples of how to carry extraordinary experiences with grace, humility, and thoughtful reflection. At times, they discussed the delicate balance between evidence and interpretation, science and anecdote, fact and perception. The physical Tracy stopped watches, marks on clothing, disturbances in the cars. Coppers remained intriguing, yet inconclusive. The psychological evidence, memories recalled under hypnosis, dreams that blurred the line between reality and imagination offered insight, while retaining ambiguity. Together, these elements underscored the complexity of human experience and the ways in which encounters with the unknown could defy simplistic explanation. Later, as they settled into the quiet of the evening, the Hills contemplated the mountains themselves, which had witnessed the unfolding of their story. The peaks, valleys, and shadowed forests carried a kind of patient memory, holding within them the echoes of a night when ordinary life intersected with something vast and inexplicable. They imagined the landscape as a silent guardian of experience, an eternal participant in a narrative that continued to ripple outward in both subtle and profound ways. Barney, looking up at the stars, mused on the continuity of time and the strange elasticity of memory, how moments of intense experience could stretch, contract, and shift in perception, leaving traces that were felt rather than easily quantified. Betty, watching the shimmer of distant constellations, recognized the metaphorical resin-sue universe itself seemed to encourage observation, reflection, and the gentle embrace of unanswered questions. Together, they sat in quiet companionship, sharing the weight and wonder of a life touched by something beyond ordinary comprehension. The memory of the encounter had become a gentle undercurrent in their daily existence, not dominating their lives, but quietly enriching them. It shaped how they listened, observed, and engaged with the world, allowing a subtle reverence for the unknown to infuse ordinary moments with depth and meaning. The Hills understood that the story they had lived was no longer theirs alone. It had become part of a larger human narrative, woven into the collective curiosity about what lies beyond perception, beyond reason, and beyond the familiar. They carried it with care, knowing that each reflection, each retelling, each quiet observation could influence how others perceived possibility, wonder, and the unknown. As the night stretched on, the forest and mountains seemed to lean closer, as if acknowledging the weight of memory and the beauty of reflection. In the darkness, with only the faint rustle of leaves and distant stars for company, the Hills felt a profound sense of connection, not only to each other and their shared experience, but to the broader universe of mystery and meaning that continued to unfold beyond the reaches of certainty. And in that stillness, they found a quiet peace. The extraordinary had touched their lives, and yet it had also deepened their appreciation for the ordinary, the rhythm of the mountains, the pulse of the night, the subtle whisper of stars. Every detail mattered, every memory resonated, and every question remained a doorway to wonder. The mountains held their secret, but the Hills carried it gently, like a soft light guiding them through every quiet night. Chapter 19. The night sky stretched endlessly above, a deep velvet canvas flecked with distant points of light, each star a silent witness to stories untold. For Betty and Barney, evenings had become moments of quiet reflection, spaces where the extraordinary and the familiar seemed to meet in delicate balance. On this particular night, they walked slowly along a narrow forest path, the scent of pine needles and damp earth grounding them even as their minds drifted toward memories that refused to fade. They often spoke in soft tones, as if raising their voices might disturb the fragile web of recollection that hung in the air between them. Barney's eyes traced the constellations, remembering the night when he had tried to decipher the star map Betty had drawn under him. Each flicker of light in the sky seemed to echo with the rhythm of that other night, reminding him that some mysteries leave traces not in evidence alone but in the quiet spaces of the mind. Betty, holding her coat closer against the chill, recalled the subtle ways in which the encounter had changed their perception of the world. Ordinary objects, the pattern of shadows on the road, the sway of the trees, the glimmer of moonlight on the river now, carried a faint resonance. Every detail felt heightened, charged with a possibility that even the most mundane moment could touch upon the extraordinary. She had learned to listen closely, not only to the world around her, but to the whispers of memory, the delicate pulse of recollection that seemed to carry its own quiet intelligence. They paused near a clearing where the moonlight pooled in silver ribbons. Barney knelt to inspect the ground, noting the small depressions and patterns that the forest had formed over years. To any casual observer, it was just a patch of earth. To the Hills, it was a reminder of the fragility of perception, of how the mind navigates spaces between memory, imagination, and reality. Their conversation wandered naturally, moving from personal reflections to broader thoughts about time and experience. "Do you ever wonder," Betty asked softly, "if we only saw what we were meant to see? If some part of it was a lesson rather than a proof?" Barney considered this, his fingers brushing over the rough bark of a nearby tree. "Maybe it's both," he said, "a lesson wrapped in something we can't fully explain. And maybe that's what keeps it alive, our minds, always searching, always questioning." The air grew cooler, and the faint rustle of nocturnal life punctuated their thoughts. A fox crossed the path in the distance, pausing briefly before disappearing into the underbrush. A reminder that life continued quietly, oblivious to human speculation and wonder. The Hills felt a kinship with these small, unseen rhythms, understanding that their story was part of a broader tapestry of existence, where the unseen and the mysterious intersected with the familiar and the everyday. In this reflective state, they turned their thoughts toward the broader cultural impact of their experience. Over the years, their story had rippled outward, touching countless lives and inspiring new ways of thinking about the unknown. Books, documentaries, films, and news reports had carried fragments of their encounter across decades, reshaping the public imagination. Yet, for the Hills, the true impact was subtle. It was in the quiet curiosity of those who read their accounts, the careful consideration of skeptics and believers alike, and the gentle expansion of collective awareness that the story had generated. They spoke of the ways in which their experience intersected with human psychology, how memory could be fluid, how trauma could shape perception, and how dreams could blend with reality in ways that were sometimes indistinguishable. Yet, in every conversation, there remained a certainty that something had occurred, something beyond the conventional, beyond the explanations offered by science and reason alone. This certainty was neither loud nor dramatic. It was a quiet, persistent presence that colored their understanding of the world. The Hills also reflected on the social dimensions of their story. Being an interracial couple in the 1960s had added layers of complexity to how they were perceived, judged, and believed. Their credibility had been scrutinized not only for the content of their narrative, but for the assumptions that society projected onto them. This intersection of personal experience and societal bias offered lessons that were as profound as the encounter itself, highlighting the ways in which perception, belief, and identity intertwine in shaping human understanding. As they continued along the forest path, the Hills noticed the subtle glow of distant lights from nearby towns, muted by the dense tree line. The glow seemed to pulse with the rhythm of memory, a gentle reminder that human life continued, often unaware of the mysteries that brushed against it in quiet moments. The Hills had learned to inhabit that tension. embracing the unknown without surrendering to fear, carrying the encounter as both a burden and a gift. Barney paused to take a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp night air. "I think the strangest part," he said slowly, "is realizing how much of life happens in between the moments we can explain, how many things go unnoticed, and yet they shape us in ways we can't measure." Betty nodded, her eyes tracing the silhouette of a distant ridge against the night sky. "Maybe that's why people connect with our story," she said. "It's not just about the lights or the missing time. It's about noticing, reflecting, and wondering about what happens when ordinary life meets something beyond ordinary." The conversation drifted into silence, each of them lost in thought as they walked. The rhythm of their steps matched the subtle cadence of the forest, and the world felt expansive and intimate at the same time. They were both aware that the encounter had altered their relationship with time, with memory, and with each other. Moments were now layered, containing both the immediate and the eternal, the seen and the unseen. Later, as they reached the edge of the forest and looked out over the rolling hills below, the hills felt a renewed sense of connection not just to each other, but to the broader landscape of mystery that extended far beyond their personal experience. The encounter had become a lens through which they observed the world, encouraging them to notice patterns, question assumptions, and embrace the unknown with calm curiosity. They spoke of the subtle lessons embedded in the night's reflections: patience, observation, humility, and the willingness to live with uncertainty. These were qualities that had been honed through years of contemplation and public attention, qualities that allowed them to carry their story with grace and quiet dignity. The extraordinary had become a part of their daily lives, not as a source of fear or obsession, but as a gentle current beneath the surface, enriching their perception of both the natural and the mysterious. As the evening deepened, they turned their attention to the stars once more. Each point of light seemed to hum with possibility, hinting at the vastness of the universe and the small yet significant place they occupied within it. The hills felt both humbled and inspired, recognizing that the encounter had expanded their awareness without demanding concrete answers, leaving room for curiosity, reflection, and the quiet thrill of wonder. Barney, resting against a tree trunk, spoke with a reflective calm. "I've come to see that not every question needs an answer. Some things exist to teach us to notice, to feel, to wonder." Betty smiled softly, understanding the weight and the gift of his words. "And maybe that's what makes it timeless," she said. "Not the proof or the fear, but the way it invites us to look deeper, to pay attention, and to remain open." In those hours beneath the vast night sky, the hills discovered a profound serenity. The encounter, once a source of anxiety and confusion, had become a quiet teacher. It shaped how they observed life, how they interacted with one another, and how they carried the story forward into the world. It reminded them that mysteries need not be solved to be meaningful, and that the journey of reflection can be as rich and transformative as any revelation. And so, as the stars shimmered faintly above and the forest whispered around them, Betty and Barney Hill embraced the gentle rhythm of memory, understanding, and wonder. The night held its secrets, the mountains cradled their reflections, and the story continued to live not only in public imagination but in the quiet spaces of their hearts, unfolding with patience, care, and a steady, enduring curiosity. And under the infinite sky, they walked together, carrying their story like a soft light that never dimmed. Chapter 20. The dawn was pale and tentative, a gentle wash of color creeping over the distant peaks of the White Mountains. The world seemed to exhale, and in that moment, time felt suspended, as though the morning itself was holding its breath. For Betty and Barney Hill, the light of a new day carried both comfort and quiet tension. Even after decades, the memory of that September night still hovered at the edges of thought, never fully gone, never fully graspable. They sat together on a small wooden bench at the edge of a lakeside trail, the water mirroring the subtle pinks and grays of the morning sky. Betty's hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers intertwined, while Barney leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes scanning the shifting patterns of mist on the water. It was in these unspoken silences that they often found the most clarity. The years had taught them that reflection did not always need words, and that some truths could only emerge in the gentle rhythm of observation. Barney spoke first, his voice a low, careful murmur. Do you remember the feeling when we first tried to make sense of it? That mix of fear, AW, and, I don't know, disbelief? Betty nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on a small ripple traveling across the lake. It's strange, she said, how memory works. Sometimes I feel like I can touch that night, and other times it's like it's a dream someone else had. Her eyes traced the reflection of the clouds, soft and undulating, and for a moment, the past and present seemed to merge in the mirrored water. The hills often reflected on how their story had transcended personal experience. Over the years, it had seeped into collective consciousness, shaping ideas about what it meant to encounter the unknown. From casual conversations to academic discussions, their narrative had become a reference point, a benchmark against which later reports and testimonies were measured. Yet, the human dimension, the intimate, personal depth of fear, confusion, and wonder remained the part that most fascinated them still. Barney reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a small notebook, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside were sketches and notes, reminders of the star map, the patterns of lights, the impressions of shapes and movement. Even now, he said, flipping carefully through the pages, I can see how every detail mattered, how small changes in perception could shift the whole story. Betty leaned over to look, her eyes softening at the familiar symbols. It's like a puzzle, she whispered. Not one with a single answer, but one that keeps revealing itself in different ways, depending on how we look. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. A distant bird called, its note echoing through the clearing, breaking the silence with a reminder of life's persistent rhythms. The hills listened, understanding that while their encounter was extraordinary, it existed within the same world that contained ordinary beauty, ordinary sounds, and ordinary routines. The juxtaposition was, in itself, a subtle lesson. The unknown often arrives quietly, within the texture of everyday life, and yet leaves marks that persist far beyond the initial moment. They spoke of human perception, how memory and imagination intertwined, how anxiety and suggestion could shape recollection, and how shared experience sometimes created an almost unexplainable resonance. Hypnosis, dreams, and reflections had revealed fragments of the night that might otherwise have remained lost. But even so, the hills recognized that some aspects of their story defied rational explanation, and thrived in the space between knowing and wondering. As they walked along the trail, the conversation shifted to cultural echoes, how the notion of extraterrestrial visitors had become a fixture in books, films, and television, how their experience had seeded imagery and archetypes that would echo across decades, and how every person who encountered their story carried a subtle awareness of the unknown, even if only subconsciously. It's remarkable, Barney said quietly, how a single night can ripple outward, touching people we've never met in ways we'll never see. Betty smiled, a soft, contemplative curve of her lips. And yet, she said, the most important impact isn't public. It's what it does to us, the way it teaches patience, reflection, and humility, the way it reminds us to listen, not just to evidence, but to the quiet rhythms of life. They paused near a bend in the path where the lake widened, sunlight now glimmering across the surface like scattered gold. A gentle breeze ruffled Betty's hair, and for a moment, the world felt completely still. Each element of nature perfectly balanced in quiet harmony. Here, the hills often found themselves contemplating the broader meaning of their experience, not in terms of proof or argument, but in terms of insight, awareness, and the capacity to live with questions that never fully resolve. Barney spoke of the responsibility that came with being witnesses, not just to the extraordinary, but to the human response to it. People expect answers, he said. They want certainty, clarity. But sometimes our job is simply to share what we know, honestly, and let others carry their own interpretations. Betty nodded, feeling the familiar weight of that truth. And it's okay, she said, to leave room for mystery, to acknowledge that some things are bigger than us, and that part of their beauty lies in not being fully graspable. They continued walking in companionable silence, the lake on one side, the dark forest on the other. Every step seemed to carry echoes of their journey from the roadside lights in New Hampshire, 2 decades of public attention. Totiskiet, reflective morning. The hills and water, the stars above, and the earth beneath, all seemed to conspire to remind them that the encounter was part of a larger, ongoing narrative, one that was both personal and universal. The Hills often discussed the idea of curiosity and wonder as living forces, subtle but persistent. They spoke of how even decades later, the urge to question, to explore, and to imagine still coursed through their reflections. It was a reminder that the human mind, while often tethered to routine and explanation, always reaches for something beyond the familiar, always seeks patterns, meaning, and connection even in the quietest, most ordinary moments. Barney leaned back against the railing at the water's edge, letting the sunlight warm his face. "I've come to understand that the most lasting mysteries aren't just the ones you can point to," he said. "They're the ones that stay with you, that change the way you see, the way you listen, the way you think about the world." Betty placed her hand on his, a soft, grounding gesture. "And they teach us," she said, "that living with uncertainty isn't a weakness. It's a form of attention, a way to stay open to life, to people, and to possibilities we can't yet name." They stayed there for a long while, gazing at the water, listening to the subtle hum of life around them. In these quiet hours, the Hills felt a profound calm, a gentle acceptance of both the known and the unknowable. The encounter had become woven into the very fabric of their being, not as a source of fear, but as a guide to reflection, empathy, and enduring curiosity. Even as the sun climbed higher, illuminating distant trees and hills, the Hills remained attuned to the invisible threads connecting memory, perception, and wonder. They understood that their story would continue to ripple outward, touching minds and hearts far beyond their immediate lives. And yet, the most profound impact remained private, intimate, and deeply personal. Quiet dance of thought, emotion, and reflection that could only exist in the gentle space between two people who had lived through the extraordinary together. The morning matured into a full day, but the Hills moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the sensation of presence, the subtle warmth of sunlight, the quiet resonance of shared understanding. In every step, every glance, every thought, they honored the delicate tension between mystery and meaning, uncertainty and insight, the ordinary and the extraordinary. And as they prepared to leave the lakeside, walking back toward the path that would take them home, there was a sense of quiet completion, a recognition that while questions remained unanswered, the journey itself, the act of reflection, and the openness to wonder were perhaps the most enduring legacies of all. And with each gentle step, they carried their story forward, not as evidence to prove, but as a quiet reminder to look, to wonder, and to embrace the unknown. Chapter 21. The evening settled over the landscape like a soft, whispered sigh, the sky turning a muted violet as the last hints of sunlight slipped behind the distant hills. There was a calm in the air, a gentle hush that seemed to hold everything in delicate suspension. This was a night of reflection, of endings and beginnings, where the story of Betty and Barney Hill could finally rest not in a resolution, but in understanding. They sat together on a small porch, the wood worn smooth by decades of use, the railing cool beneath their hands. The world around them seemed to exhale, the leaves rustling softly in a breeze that carried the subtle scent of pine and earth. For the Hills, the extraordinary events of September 1961 had become more than memory. They had become a prism through which to view life, curiosity, and the nature of human experience. Barney leaned back, letting the chair rock gently beneath him, and closed his eyes for a moment. "It's strange," he murmured, "how a single night can stretch across so many years, touch so many lives, and still feel present, like it never really left us at all." Betty's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the first stars began to shimmer faintly. "And maybe that's the point," she said softly. "Not that we understand everything, but that we live with it, that it shapes us, and that it teaches us to look closer at the world and each other." Her fingers brushed against his in a quiet gesture of shared history and enduring connection. The Hills often reflected on how their story had evolved from a personal, terrifying experience into a cultural touchstone, a narrative that shaped the imagination of generations. Their encounter had introduced the archetype of the gray alien, the idea of missing time, the tension between witness testimony and skepticism. It had sparked discussions of memory, consciousness, and the boundaries of human perception. And yet, for all the public fascination, the Hills understood that the truest impact of their experience was deeply personal. Living in the subtle ways it changed how they viewed themselves and the world. They spoke of courage, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet, enduring kind, the courage to face uncertainty, to share vulnerability, and to live with questions that may never be answered. Each reflection was gentle, thoughtful, measured, as though the years had taught them to move carefully through memory, to honor it without becoming trapped by it. Barney picked up a small notebook, its pages filled with sketches, notes, and the faint impressions of star maps drawn decades earlier. Every detail mattered, he said. Even the things we barely remember, they shaped the narrative in ways we didn't foresee. Betty smiled, tracing the lines of a familiar sketch. And the details that remain unclear, she whispered, are part of the beauty. Life, memory, the universe. They aren't meant to be fully solved. They're meant to be experienced, slowly, with attention and care. The sky darkened gradually, stars flickering like distant lanterns suspended in the velvet night. A soft breeze carried the gentle rustle of leaves and the faint hum of the world settling into quiet rhythms. The Hills sat together, letting the silence speak, letting it carry the weight of years, of fear, of awe, and of wonder. They often spoke of legacy, not the kind measured in fame or recognition, but the kind that lives in subtle influence, in the ways a story or an experience ripples quietly through time. We didn't choose this, Bonnie said, voice low, but we can shape what it means, how it's remembered, how it's understood, and how it inspires people to question, to explore, and to stay open. Betty nodded, eyes reflecting the first glimmer of the Milky Way. It's a story of curiosity, she said, of paying attention, of acknowledging that there's more out there than what we see, and more inside us than we sometimes realize. They reflected on the journey they had taken together, from the roadside encounter to the hypnosis sessions, the public attention, the debates between believers and skeptics. Each phase had left its mark. Each chapter of their lives had intertwined with the story in ways that were sometimes painful, sometimes illuminating, and always profound. Even as they looked back, they recognized that the narrative was not linear, not neat. Life rarely is. The story of that night of the lights to craft, the figures, the missing time lived not just in events, but in memory, in emotion, and in the quiet moments when wonder met reflection. It was a story that could never be fully captured, only gently unfolded, layer by layer, in the minds and hearts of those who listened, who questioned, who imagined. The Hills spoke of hope, too, not in the sense of certainty, but as a quiet, sustaining presence. Hope that people could remain curious, that knowledge and wonder could coexist, that humanity could embrace mystery without fear. Even if the world never fully understands, Betty said, there is value in trying, in sharing, in reflecting. That's where meaning lives. Barney added, and maybe the most important lesson is humility, to recognize that we are small parts of a vast universe, that our understanding is limited, and that some experiences exist to teach patience and attention, rather than deliver answers. They sat in companionable silence, the kind that only comes from decades of shared life and shared mystery. The stars above grew brighter, a tapestry of infinite points stretching across the sky, each one a reminder of the possibilities beyond their own comprehension. In the soft hum of the night, they felt the echoes of that September evening still present, not as fear, but as a gentle reminder of wonder, curiosity, and the enduring beauty of the unknown. And as they finally rose from the porch, the cool night air brushing against their faces, there was a sense of quiet completion, not an ending of questions, but an acceptance of them, not a resolution of mystery, but a recognition of its place in the fabric of life. The Hills had walked the long path from encounter to reflection, and in that journey, they had discovered something more enduring than explanation. The power of observation, of mindfulness, and of embracing the unknown with grace. Every story, they realized, leaves traces, not just in documents, books, or films, but in the subtle ways it changes thought, sparks imagination, and encourages reflection. And the story of Betty and Barney Hill, their brush with the extraordinary, would continue to ripple outward, quietly, persistently, and with gentle insistence, inviting each new listener, reader, or dreamer to pause, to wonder, and to look up at the night sky with openness. The last thing they did before retiring for the night was look at the stars once more. No words were needed. The silence held them, held the story, and held the infinite possibilities beyond the edges of human understanding. It was a moment of peace, a night of quiet revelation, and a final chapter, not of closure, but of continuity, a gentle invitation for all who would come after to embrace mystery with patience, curiosity, and awe. And wheat, that the night wrapped the hills in its gentle arms, carrying them forward into rest, reflection, and the quiet knowledge that some mysteries, no matter how elusive, have the power to illuminate life itself. And so their story rests here, not as an ending, but as an open door to wonder, waiting for those willing to step inside. As the stars drifted higher into the velvet night, the world seemed to exhale, carrying with it the soft weight of questions that had no immediate answers. Betty and Barney Hill's story, that strange and luminous September night, was no longer just a memory confined to the pages of history. It had become a quiet companion to everyone who had listened, who had wondered, who had allowed themselves to pause and imagine. There is something profoundly human about curiosity. It's a gentle tug at the edges of understanding, a whisper that says, there is more than what you see. The Hills felt it that night, in the shimmer of lights above the white mountains, in the tremor of the unknown pressing close. And we, in hearing their story, feel it too. Not as fear, not as disbelief, but as that tender stirring of wonder that can settle in your chest and linger quietly, inviting reflection. Stories like this remind us that the universe is vast and patient. It does not rush. It does not always explain. And yet, it leaves tracy subtle signs, fleeting glimmers, moments that shimmer just long enough for us to notice, to question, and to grow. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be carried, slowly, with reverence, as we move through our own lives, as we make sense of our own experiences, and as we discover how small acts of attention can open doors to understanding. Perhaps the lasting gift of the Hill story is not in the lights they saw or the missing hours they endured, but in the way it teaches us to look, to listen, and to imagine. It teaches patience with the unknown, empathy for those who experience the extraordinary, and courage to share what we cannot fully explain. For every person who has ever glimpsed something strange in the night sky, who has woken from a dream that felt like memory, or who has quietly pondered the limits of human understanding, their story becomes a mirror. It reflects our own desire to reach beyond, to explore, and to connect with something greater than ourselves. So, as the night deepens, let the stillness of this moment settle over you. Feel the gentle pulse of the world around you, the quiet hum of life, and the infinite expanse above. Let curiosity linger in your thoughts. Let wonder rest softly in your mind. And let the story of Betty and Barney Hill be a quiet invitation, a reminder that even in uncertainty, there is beauty, there is meaning, and there is a quiet, enduring magic in looking up and wondering. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and the world drifts toward dream, carry this thought with you. Some mysteries never fully unfold, yet they leave their gentle, unending mark on the heart. Cinematic trailer prompt AI. Human production prompt for AI visuals. Video editors. A dark, mysterious, forested mountain road at night. Soft mist swirling through dense white mountains. A glowing, erratic UFO hovering silently above the road. Multicolored lights reflecting on the asphalt. A shadowy couple in a car watches in awe and fear. Binoculars trembling in hands. Slow-motion close-ups of glowing alien eyes and mysterious figures inside the craft. A soft, hypnotic orchestral score builds tension, interspersed with faint rhythmic beeps. Ethereal light beams sweep across trees, fog, and the couple. The scene transitions to dreamlike flashes. Star maps, mysterious symbols, hypnotic swirling colors, and blurred silhouettes of beings. Cinematic camera angles. Low ground level, aerial view, close-up on expressions. foggy depth of field, soft voiceover whispers. When the ordinary meets the extraordinary, the truth awaits. Render in 4K cinematic, dark, atmospheric tones, slow pacing, high contrast, hyper-realistic details.